At the 2024 Lennart Meri Conference in Tallinn, representatives of the 3 Baltic nations delivered a chilling warning to attendees. We're getting ready to march into Ukraine. All 3, Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia, are ready to cross the border into Ukraine to help defend it against Russia, regardless of whether they have approval from NATO. In doing so, they would escalate tensions with Russia to near breaking point while creating a massive dilemma for NATO. Should it join the Baltic nations in more directly defending Ukraine, or sit back and wait to see how Russia responds? One thing is clear: the Baltic states see Russia's rising aggression as a major threat to their sovereignty. And that raises some key questions. What would convince the Baltics to send soldiers into Ukraine, and why would they want to do so in the first place? What are the implications for NATO? Plus, exactly how much of an impact would the militaries of these 3 countries have should they enter Ukraine? Let's start by digging deeper into the Baltic announcement. In May 2024, Yahoo News reported on several members of the Baltic states attending the Lennart Meri Conference. There, they issued their warning to representatives from Germany, claiming that they were collectively prepared to march into Ukraine. Those threats, the outlet says, come as a result of all 3 nations being frustrated with Germany's approach to the use of its weapons in the Ukraine war. Namely, they're not happy that Germany has yet to permit Ukraine to use German-supplied weapons on Russian territory. The Baltic countries see the German response as half-hearted. They think it will do little to deter Russia if President Vladimir Putin and his troops know that they can focus on Ukraine without worrying about strikes on Russian territory. Worse yet, they open the door for Russia to gain significant ground in Ukraine, particularly in the eastern region of Kharkiv. If that happens, those gains would represent a major threat to both the Baltic states and Poland. Cautioning restraint, as Germany is doing, could backfire, according to the Baltics. After all, it could lead to Russia finally taking Ukraine, perhaps giving Putin the springboard he needs to launch other invasions in the Baltics. However, it's important to note at this point that none of the Baltics have sent troops into Ukraine yet. They may not even do so. Militani, a Ukrainian news website focused on war in the military, suggests that the Baltics would only consider troop deployment if Russia makes significant frontline gains due to Ukraine not having sufficient Western support. In other words, the Baltics are focusing as much on their own defense as that of Ukraine. Russian success in the latter could spell bad news for the former. This is far from the only indication that the Baltics are getting ready to fight. Another Militani report, this time from May 20, 2024, notes that Estonia's Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, has pointed out that there are troops from several countries in Ukraine already. Those soldiers provide training to Ukraine's forces. Estonia isn't one of those countries yet, with Kallas saying that such an action would require parliamentary approval. But she also says it's an open, public discussion, but I think we shouldn't rule anything out right now. In other words, Estonia sending troops into Ukraine is a possibility. There are also reports of the Baltics shoring up their border defenses to consider. In March 2024, The Conversation published an article discussing the collective decision of the defense ministers of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia to create a shared Baltic Common Defense Zone along their borders in January. Though full details of this zone aren't available, it's believed it will contain several physical defensive structures, including bunkers. In fact, Estonia is set to begin construction on 600 of these bunkers in 2025, in addition to working alongside the other Baltic states to develop missile artillery. The country has also doubled the size of its territorial defense force to 20,000. Latvia is doubling the size of its armed forces as well, to 61,000 by 2032, and reintroduced mandatory military conscription in 2023. As for Lithuania, The Conversation says it has formed an agreement that allows it to install a permanent brigade of 4,800 soldiers on the border it shares with Russia by 2027. In short, the Baltic states are preparing for war. That's where NATO might come into play. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania are all NATO members, having joined the organization in March 2004. That membership entitles them to collective defense as part of Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which states that an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all. As such, every other NATO country is duty-bound to jump to the defense of any of the Baltic nations if Russia attacks them. Defense is the key word here. If the Baltic countries decide to enter Ukraine on their own volition, would the rest of NATO consider any Russian strikes resulting from that decision to be grounds to fight alongside the Baltics? After all, Russia would argue that the Baltic states provoked the attacks by joining Ukraine on the battlefield, meaning they're the aggressors. Other NATO members may argue that Article 5 doesn't apply in this situation because they won't be defending the Baltic states from Russia. They would be joining it in an attack on the Russian Federation. However, the Baltics represent an important buffer zone between Russia and the rest of Europe. NATO can't allow Russia to take those three states. It would give Russia more control over the Baltic Sea, as well as important strategic positions it might use to intimidate or attack Sweden, Finland, Poland, and other nearby nations. Perhaps NATO members might find themselves in a catch-22 situation. Either they treat a Russian response to the Baltic nations as enough to trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter, meaning they also get involved in the Ukraine war, or they sit back and wait, potentially allowing a situation in which Russia gains more territory and becomes an even greater threat to the rest of Europe. That may be the point from the Baltic perspective. Rather than waiting for NATO to act, which all three agree is an invitation to Russia to continue its aggression, they'll take the situation into their own hands. In doing so, they'll force a decision from their NATO allies: fight with us or risk losing us to the Russian Federation. It's a dangerous game, though one all three seem willing to play. The question is simple: why? Why are Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all three of which combined likely can't defeat the Russian military, so willing to risk incurring Putin's wrath by sending their troops into Ukraine? There are several answers to this question, with one already having been discussed. The Baltic countries believe that much of the Western response to the Ukraine crisis has been underwhelming. They argue that nobody seems to be taking the true threat Russia poses, as they see it, seriously, and that Russia may target them next if they succeed in Ukraine. Better to get ahead of the issue by fighting in Ukraine than waiting for Ukraine to fall and reacting to what Russia does next. As for why the three nations believe that they're potential targets for Putin, all three will see historical parallels between themselves and Ukraine. After all, just like Ukraine, they fell under Soviet rule in the aftermath of World War II. For Latvia, that resulted in a complete loss of its independent democracy. Though the territory had spent most of its history being ruled by other countries, the Russian Revolution of 1917 opened the door for Latvia to declare its independence from Russia in 1918. 2 years later, following fighting with both Russia and Germany, the budding Soviet Union recognized Latvia as an independent country. That independence existed under a democratic structure until 1934, when President Kalaris Ulmanis established autocratic rule. Then 1939 came along, and Latvia was essentially merged into the Soviet Union, first being forced to hand over military bases to the Red Army before being fully occupied by Russia in 1940. Though the Soviets played a large part in defeating the Nazis that claimed Latvia between 1941 and 1944, that help came at a huge cost. Latvia officially became part of the Soviet Union after the war, with Russia collectivizing its farms in 1949 and integrating its economy into that of the Soviet Union. The National History Museum of Latvia notes that this early occupation, particularly the years under Joseph Stalin's regime until 1953, was marked by arrests, imprisonments, and deportations. The first year of Soviet occupation alone brought with it the deportation of about 35,000 native Latvians, most part of the country's intelligentsia, with many thousands more following in later years. Exclusion from education, constant exposure to Soviet propaganda, and the Soviet Union trying to instill its concept of planned economy in Latvia were all hallmarks of this time in the country's history. Yet a large contingent of the nation's population yearned for the days before Russia arrived, the 20 or so years in which it was independent. When the Soviet Union was finally on the brink of collapse, Latvia managed to obtain its independence once again. August 21, 1991 saw the country become a separate state. Its people have no intention of allowing today's Russia to return it to Soviet rule. Estonia and Lithuania have similar stories. For Estonia, annexation by the Soviet Union came on August 6, 1940. Thousands tried to resist, with the University of Central Arkansas stating that 1,750 Estonians were killed as a result of the country's resistance. Tragically, a further 7,450 died between August 1940 and September 1944. As seen in Latvia, the Soviet regime began mass deportations even before the end of World War II, which culminated in 10,200 Estonians being sent to Siberian labor camps. A further 35,000 Estonians were conscripted into the Soviet military between July and August 1941. Again, like Latvia, Estonia fell under the Nazi regime during the middle stages of World War II, and again, as seen in Latvia, the Soviet Union successfully fought the Nazis off. But that period of fighting led to 70,000 Estonians fleeing to Sweden and Germany, along with a further 250,000 displacements and 39,000 more deaths. Following the war, Estonia became part of the Soviet Union. Early Soviet rule forced even more devastation on the nation's people. Over 2 days in March 1949, the Soviets deported some 20,700 Estonians to Siberian labor camps, of whom 3,750 died during the journey. More imprisonments came under Stalin, with the years between 1944 and 1951 seeing 30,000 Estonians arrested under political pretenses. Some in the country tried to resist. A collective calling itself the Forest Brothers, which was 15,000 people strong, staged an insurgency in 1944. It was to no avail. Estonia, like Latvia, fell under the Soviet yoke. Estonia was a little faster to throw off the Soviet Union than Latvia. September 1988 saw around 250,000 Estonians take part in pro-independence demonstrations. 2 years later, there was a call for independence by the Estonian Supreme Council. An official declaration followed on August 20, 1991, just one day before Latvia gained its own independence. Then there's Lithuania. In many ways, Lithuania's history echoes that of Estonia and Latvia. Lithuania had enjoyed around 20 years of independence from Russian rule before June 1940, when the Soviet Union invaded the country. It forced Lithuania to cut all of its existing political ties. Lithuania was also subject to a secret protocol within the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. It stated that any territorial arrangement of the Baltic region would see the country's northern boundary represent the end of the Soviet influence and the beginning of Nazi territory. As with Latvia and Estonia, the first 2 years of Soviet occupation saw mass deportations. Around 35,000 native Lithuanians were forced out of the country before Germany launched an attack of its own. Again, the story mirrors that of the other Baltic states, several years of Nazi occupation before the Soviet Union regained control. A guerrilla resistance existed in the country between the mid-1940s and early 1950s. Numbering about 40,000, these forces tried to combat the Russification of Lithuania and the repression that came with it. It failed, with Russia's extensive deportations cutting huge swathes out of the resistance until Lithuania was forced to comply with the Soviet systems being imposed on it. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the period between 1947 and 1949 alone saw 220,000 Lithuanians get deported. Many would be sent to labor camps in Siberia and elsewhere in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union enforced the collectivization of agriculture, as it had in Latvia, yet underground resistance existed. For instance, Lithuania produced more samizdat, or unsanctioned publications, than any other country in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. As with its Baltic neighbors, the desire for independence existed. That desire was realized in 1990 when elections in Lithuania resulted in a legislature that declared the country's independence. The Soviets attempted to topple the newly independent government in January 1991. That attempted coup failed, and as we saw with Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania secured full independence in August 1991. Understanding this history is key to recognizing the Baltic position. All three countries have lived under Russian repression. They fought hard for their independence, and they know that they'll likely be the next targets if Putin succeeds in Ukraine. After all, as Putin made clear during his February 2024 interview with Tucker Carlson, the restoration of territory to Russia is one of the main motivations behind his actions in Ukraine. He sees Ukraine as part of Russia based on historical context. He likely sees the Baltics in the same way. All were part of the Soviet Union between the 1940s and 1990s, and all fell under Russian control prior to the country's 1917 revolution. The Baltic nations have also had to watch Russia grow increasingly aggressive over the last 2 decades. While the special military operation in Ukraine is the most obvious example of this aggression, they won't ignore Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. Then there's the Russo-Georgian War of 2008, which was over in just days, but marked the first war Europe saw in the 21st century. Like the Baltic states, Georgia was part of the Soviet Union. Worse yet, the response to Russia's invasion of the country from the international community was surprisingly muted, an early sign to the Baltic states that their allies weren't taking Putin's aggression seriously. They believe they can't afford to allow the rest of Europe to make the same mistake. And these aren't the only reasons why the Baltic states are considering entering Ukraine. Putin has also made direct threats to all three of them. On May 22, 2024, mere days before the Baltic nations discussed sending troops into Ukraine at the Lennart-Meri conference, Politico reported on a Russian draft decree. Though that decree is now deleted, it showed a Russian proposal for the redrawing of its borders within the Baltic Sea. The proposal would essentially see Russia take control of sea territory currently overseen by Finland and Lithuania, with the latter being quick to respond that the draft represented little more than a threat. As Lithuania's foreign minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, said to Politico, Russia's actions are seen as deliberate, targeted, escalatory provocations to intimidate neighboring countries and their societies. This is further proof that Russia's aggressive and revisionist policy is a threat to the security of neighboring countries and Europe as a whole. Perhaps that statement could be more accurately categorized as yet another wake-up call delivered to Europe from the Baltic states. Finally, there's Sweden and Finland's decision to join NATO to consider. While certainly good news for NATO as a collective, and the Baltic states in terms of their concerns about Russia, it also brought more threats from Putin. That's because Putin recognizes that Sweden and Finland being part of NATO opens up the Baltic Sea to NATO's forces. Bad news for Russia, given that it sees the Baltic Sea as strategically important to its navy. Its exclave Kaliningrad, for instance, is home to the only Russian port on the Baltic Sea that's available all year round. An increased NATO presence in that region could provoke action from Russia's president. The narrative around Sweden and Finland joining has certainly suggested that many NATO members consider their decision a victory in the Baltic region. Chatham House points out that some have even started to refer to the sea as a NATO lake. Now the collective can run more training operations and is in a better place to defend itself from Russian aggression. However, the decision also opens the door for Russia to push back, potentially leading to it taking a more aggressive stance against the Baltic states. If it does, those states argue, NATO needs to be as ready as they are to fight back. All of which brings us back to the Baltic statements about heading into Ukraine with or without NATO. If they follow through, what can they deliver to Kyiv? All three have already been massive supporters of Ukraine during the war. They each fall into the top 5 in terms of military aid provided as a percentage of gross domestic product or GDP. Latvia has provided 1.5% of its GDP, combined with bilateral donations and those made via the European Union, while Estonia and Lithuania have each provided 1.8%. They also led the way in terms of institutionalizing the aid they provide. Lithuania, for example, has pledged to offer constant support to Ukraine through 2026. The Baltic states see these contributions as being akin to their bolstering their own defenses. All are also engaged in concerted campaigns of derussification. Latvia has adopted a new law that will see Russian language teaching phased out of public education by 2025. In July 2023, Lithuania stripped residency permits from 135 Russians living in the country, all of whom it deemed security threats. Estonia has taken similar action, in addition to barring Russians from crossing its border soon after the Ukraine war began. The message is clear from all three. They not only oppose the war, but are actively trying to rid themselves of the Russian influences that remain following the Soviet Union's collapse. As for the direct military assistance each could provide, it's important to note that none of the Baltic states are considered particularly strong, especially when compared to Russia. In Global Firepower's 2024 ratings of 145 military nations, all land in the bottom half of the list. Estonia's position of 87 out of the 145 is the best the Baltics can muster. But that doesn't mean they would not be useful in the fighting. Starting with Latvia, the lowest ranked of the three at 99, the country has 65,750 military personnel, of whom 17,250 are part of its active military. The rest make up its reserves, along with 12,500 that are part of paramilitary groups. Unfortunately for Ukraine, Latvia has no tanks, though it maintains a stock of 1,544 vehicles. It could also bring 59 units of self-propelled artillery into Ukraine, as well as lean on its 6 mine warfare vessels to cause issues in the Baltic Sea. An underwhelming force perhaps, especially when considering who Latvia will be fighting, but that small army will be propped up by Lithuania and Estonia. GFP says that Lithuania could bring more military personnel into Ukraine as it has 141,150 in total. Granted, only 23,000 of those people are part of its active military. However, it has 104,000 reservists upon whom it could call, along with 14,150 paramilitary troops. Like Latvia, it has no tanks to offer, though it can bring about 1,300 vehicles to the fight. Add to that its self-propelled artillery and towed artillery, 21 and 54 units respectively, and you have a decent amount of ground warfare equipment. Like Latvia, Lithuania's navy is small, consisting of just 11 assets. However, 4 of those are mine warfare ships, creating the potential for it to team up with Latvia to make the Baltic Sea a more dangerous place for Russian ships. Lithuania would also be able to bring a handful of helicopters and fixed transports to the fight. Finally, there's Estonia. The most powerful of the three according to GFP's rankings. Estonia has 96,500 military personnel, of whom 7,700 are active. It brings 6 units of rocket artillery to the conflict, along with 24 self-propelled artillery units. Plus, it could add another 1,409 vehicles to Ukraine's forces. A handful of helicopters and fixed-wing transports would also prove useful, as might Estonia's small navy. It could add 4 more mine warfare ships to the Baltic Sea. These stats show that none of the Baltic nations are powerhouses, but perhaps that isn't the point. The 3 states will feel a certain kinship with Ukraine, having all previously fallen under Soviet rule themselves. They'll also see Putin making threats against them, and likely consider themselves the next target should Ukraine fall. For that reason, they'd enter the conflict with motivation, not only to help Ukraine but to defend themselves. They could potentially stretch the war's front lines to include their borders, spreading Russia's troops thin in the process, and use their navies to force Russia to expend resources in the Baltic Sea. Then there's the NATO question. Would the Baltic states entering Ukraine serve as a signal to NATO, and particularly the organization's European states, that it has to get involved? Maybe that's what the Baltic states hope for. All three will know that their militaries aren't powerful enough to cause major problems for Russia without support from the West. By entering Ukraine, they may seek to show just how fragile the Baltic buffer between Russia and Europe is, forcing NATO to respond to prevent Russia from taking their territory. If so, it's a risky gambit. Only time will tell if the Baltic nations follow through on their proclamations that they'll enter the Ukraine war if Russia takes more ground. With that, we conclude today's video. Let us know what impact you think Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia could have on the Ukraine war if they joined. Would they manage to force NATO's hand, or would the rest of Europe sit back and wait to see how it all pans out? It's March 2024, and teams of high school students from around Europe have descended on Italy to take part in the European Robotics Championship. The stakes are high. The best performers from this collection of students will punch their tickets to take part in the World Robotics Championships in Houston, Texas, a chance for these talented youngsters to get noticed and potentially go on to study in the United States. Lithuania sends 4 teams to participate. The Baltic state had already expressed its concerns with the championships because it allowed Russian teams to take part. They wrote in protest urging the event's organizers to ban the Russian students, only to find themselves roundly rejected. Still, they chose to take part. Why shouldn't they? This is their opportunity too, and they shouldn't refuse it simply because they would be competing against Russian students. Only, they weren't competing. At least that was the case for 2 of the Lithuanian teams, Lituanica X and Litbot, that were told that to pass through to the World Championships, they would have to compete against other countries in alliance with the Russian teams. Those 2 Lithuanian teams refused. Instead, they raised their own nation's flag, along with the flag of Ukraine, at the competition to show their solidarity with Ukraine and their opposition to what they view as the Russian invasion of a country that should be independent. Lithuania's high schoolers bore a heavy cost for this act of protest. Despite the 4 teams being among the competition leaders, giving them a great chance to head to Houston, their refusal to work alongside Russia's robotics students led them to being docked points. Ultimately, they didn't qualify. But their refusal to work alongside Russia served as a microcosm of a trend that's been occurring since the war in Ukraine started: the de-Russification of the Baltic states. These 3 states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, are roundly rejecting Russian influence across the board. And in this video, we're going to ask the key question: why? To find our answers, we first have to start with a history lesson. On June 15, 1940, France's initial resistance to its Nazi occupiers finally crumbled. France fell, opening the door for Adolf Hitler and his regime to launch an attack on Great Britain. Though that event triggered the darkest days in Europe for many countries that were involved in World War II, Joseph Stalin and his Soviet cronies saw an opportunity to consolidate power while also building up the Soviet Union's defenses against the Nazi forces. Stalin sent an ultimatum to Lithuania, one of the 3 Baltic states that border the Baltic Sea and, at the time, one of the countries that could provide Stalin with a clear path into Finland. Stalin wanted Finland. He had already concentrated attacks on the country in an effort to claim it as Soviet territory, leading to his ultimatum to Lithuania being a simple one. It must form a government that was acceptable to the Soviet Union, in addition to allowing as many troops as Stalin wanted to move through the country on their way to Finland. Antanas Smetona, the president of Lithuania, quickly fled the country, leading to the installation of a people's government that granted the Soviets their access. Over the next couple of days, Stalin issued similar ultimatums to Latvia and Estonia, with similar results in both countries. The turnaround in the Baltic states was rapid. The communist parties in each country, which were previously extremely small and held little influence over the Baltics, suddenly became the most powerful political forces in the 3 regions. As for the Soviets themselves, they set about working with these parties to create a new regime, ignoring the constitutions each of the 3 countries had in place as they assimilated Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia into the Soviet Union. Property became nationalized. Mass deportations began, primarily focused on women and children who were sent to the most inhospitable desert and Arctic regions in the Soviet Union. All told, Latvia and Lithuania lost 35,000 people to these deportations, but Estonia bore the worst of it. The country lost 60,000 people. Those deportations continued even as the Nazis came knocking on the Baltic states' collective doorstep. At first, many in the Baltics considered the Nazis to be their liberators. They hoped that Germany would force the Soviet Union out, allowing each state to re-establish independent governments while also returning nationalized properties to their original owners. That isn't what happened. Germany instead turned the Baltic region into a new territorial unit, which it dubbed Ostland, and began a campaign of Nazification. Baltic support for Germany disappeared, with the three countries spending the rest of the war being fought over by Germany and the Soviet Union. They were little more than pawns in a global war, and the ravages of that war were made clear when it finally ended. Lithuania lost 15% of its population to the fighting, Estonia lost 25%, and Latvia, the worst affected of the three, saw its population decline by 30%. Estimates place the total wartime and occupation deaths in the three countries during World War II at 520,000 people. The end of World War II brought no reprieve for the Baltic states. Rather than being granted their independence, each was made a Soviet republic, with Stalin working on integrating the three countries into the Soviet Union. Resistance movements existed, but they couldn't stop the march of Soviet industrialization. For the next 40 years, until the mid-1980s and the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Baltics were little more than states within the Soviet Union. Still, the 1980s brought change. Gorbachev attempted to reform the Soviet system during that decade, creating possibilities for the Baltic countries. Moscow's centralized power structure began to weaken, with mass movements such as the Lithuanian Movement for Reconstruction and the Popular Fronts of both Latvia and Estonia began fighting for change. They challenged the legality of the Baltic states' incorporation into the Soviet Union in 1989, prompting a huge demonstration that saw 500,000 people form a human chain linking Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia to protest against the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 that had allowed the continued occupation by the Soviets in the first place. Finally, 1990 brought with it true change. All three countries held proper elections for the first time in decades, with all three voting in pro-independence parties. As the Soviet Union collapsed, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia spent the 1990s establishing their independence once more. They formed new constitutions, created their own currencies, and started establishing relationships with other countries. The 2000s brought with them continuous economic growth, capped in 2004 when all three of the Baltic nations joined the European Union, or EU, and NATO. After around 60 years, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia could finally claim to be free of Russian oppression. Why does all of this matter? This history goes some way toward explaining why we're seeing what we're seeing in the Baltics right now, but it also explains the need for derussification in these states in the first place. Though they've been long free from the Soviet Union, all three countries still contain large Russian elements in various ways. But over the last 2 years, all three have started to reject those influences outright. We'll start with Lithuania, the home of the robotics teams that refused to collaborate with the Russian teams to win a competition that clearly meant a lot to them. Their single act of defiance is emblematic of a wider movement within Lithuania to rid the country of its Russian influences as much as possible. On a wider political level, Lithuania has been working to rid itself of Russian influence ever since the outbreak of war in Ukraine. For instance, Le Monde reported in April 2023 that Lithuania's parliament passed a series of amendments to its laws that placed extremely tight sanctions on any Russians who might attempt to claim citizenship in the country. Lasting for 1 year, those sanctions suspended applications for temporary resident permits and led to Lithuania outright refusing to accept any visa applications from Russian citizens except in the most exceptional of circumstances. Worse yet for prospective Russian immigrants, Lithuania's new laws also prevented them from buying property in the country for at least 1 year. So even those who make it into Lithuania may discover that they struggle to find somewhere to live. This isn't an example of Lithuania trying to remain neutral in a war that doesn't affect it. Instead, this vote was a clear message from the country that it supports Ukraine wholeheartedly. The immigration figures prove this, as Lithuania has accepted 75,000 Ukrainian refugees since the outbreak of war in February 2022, with 42,000 of those refugees having received temporary residence permits that will likely last for as long as the war continues. There's more. Beyond restricting Russian citizens' access to the country, Lithuania has also been working hard to weed out what it sees as risks to its national security. In August 2023, AP News reported that Lithuania declared a staggering 1,164 citizens of Russia and Belarus as threats to the country's security, with that declaration being accompanied by the stripping of permanent residencies of 1,164 individuals. The inclusion of Belarusian citizens in these numbers is also interesting. In fact, the announcement applies more to them than Russian citizens. 910 of the 1,164 are Belarusian, showing that Lithuania isn't just focusing on eliminating Russian influence from the country. It's also trying to rid itself of Russia's supporters. At the time of writing the script for this video, Lithuania is reaching the end of the initial year of sanctions mentioned earlier. The country's parliament is currently debating whether to extend the sanctions on citizenship and property ownership for a further year, having already rejected the restriction of free travel for Russians and Belarusians throughout Lithuania. Still, what we see here is a country that has drawn a clear line in the sand. Lithuania supports Ukraine. That much is obvious from the fact that the 128 members of the country's parliament united in declaring Russia's actions in Ukraine a genocide, essentially labeling Russia as a terrorist state in the process. It's also obvious from how ready Lithuania has been to welcome Ukrainian refugees, as well as from the level of financial and military support it's provided to Kyiv. In January 2024, Lithuania announced it would be sending a further $214 million to Ukraine, accounting for a little under a tenth of the country's entire military budget for 2024. Lithuania supports Ukraine so strongly that it's actively punishing Russians who attempt to move to the country. And it's not alone among the Baltic states, as we can see a similar opposition to Russian influence in Latvia. Like Lithuania, Latvia is imposing annual visa restrictions on Russian citizens who attempt to enter the country. It extended those restrictions in February 2024, with the country's foreign ministry announcing that Russians won't be allowed in the country until March 2025, unless they meet strict criteria. Those criteria include the ownership of an existing EU or Latvian residence permit, or that the Russian immigrant is a diplomatic staff member or the family of such a member. Latvia has also imposed sanctions against Russian citizens in the country, though it hasn't quite gone to the extent of Lithuania. For instance, April 2023 brought with it reports that the country implemented sanctions against 10 Russian people who were connected to the Kremlin's sentencing of a human rights defender named Vladimir Kara-Murza. Those 10 individuals received full travel bans, with Latvia's President Edgars Rinkēvičs going on to encourage the EU to place similar restrictions on the 10 people in question. Again, we see evidence of resistance against Russian influence throughout the country. And there's even more. In February 2024, Latvia became the first EU member state to impose a complete ban on agricultural products from Russia and Belarus. That appears to be a response to Russia essentially using the Baltic states' port infrastructure and grain storage capacity as a hub for its farming activity. Latvia clearly wants no part in helping Russian farmers profit from their products, with Latvia's decision meaning it will miss out on around 300 million euros of Russian imports annually until the ban is lifted. There's evidence that Latvia is trying to erase Russian culture from the country. Starting with the 2026-27 school year, Latvian schools will stop teaching Russian as a second language, with the schools instead asked to choose from one of the other official languages of the EU. So Latvia is in the derussification game for the long term. By eradicating Russian in schools, it will create a whole generation of Latvians who don't speak the language and thus can't or won't work alongside the Russian population in the country. And that's a large population. About 25% of Latvia's population of 1.8 million are ethnic Russians, with the move to ban Russian from schools sending a clear message to those existing citizens: you aren't welcome and your culture is being phased out. Like Lithuania, Latvia has also come out in staunch support of Ukraine during the war. It joined its fellow Baltic nations in declaring President Vladimir Putin's invasion a genocide, again meaning that Latvia is essentially treating Russia as a terrorist state. And like Lithuania, Latvia regularly sends military and financial aid to Ukraine. January 2024 saw Latvian President Edgars Rinkēvičs announce a new military aid package that he said would include howitzers, 155mm ammunition, anti-tank weapons, rockets, grenades, helicopters, drones, communication devices, generators, as well as other equipment. That's a pretty strong commitment, made even stronger by Latvia's decision to commit 1% of its GDP to supporting Ukraine. So Russia is 0 for 2 in terms of engendering any sort of support for its special military operation from the Baltic states. And the situation doesn't get much better for Putin in the Kremlin when we turn our attention to Estonia. In September 2022, Estonia banned entry into the country for all Russian visa holders who wish to visit for purposes related to sports, tourism, culture, or simply to visit family and friends. It went a step even further. Russians aren't allowed to enter Estonia even if they're only passing through on their way to another country. These restrictions are also in place in Latvia and Lithuania, as well as Poland, adding to those countries' restrictions on Russian citizens claiming residence. The move cut off Russian access to the Schengen zone, which is the world's largest free travel region. Created through a joint effort by France, Belgium, Germany, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, the zone hosts 420 million people from 27 countries, 23 of which are members of the EU. Now Russian citizens can't pass through that zone, regardless of their visa status or whether they have a passport, which further restricts Russian movement throughout Europe. All thanks to Estonia. We're also seeing similar steps to those Latvia is taking in terms of eliminating Russian culture from Estonia altogether. For instance, in 2023, Hype and Hyper interviewed Andrei Makarievich, a Russian professor who lives in Estonia, who highlighted several changes he's seen since the war with Ukraine began. These changes include Estonia ending the availability of Russian radio and television programs, essentially ostracizing the Russian members of its population from the mainstream entertainment sector. Makarichev also highlights how attitudes towards Russians have changed since February 2022. He points out that the Estonian Russian-speaking community was afraid to be accused of being Russians because, when they realized what Russia did with Ukraine, they just saw huge negative feelings about Russia that might be projected onto them. A strange in-between situation arose, according to Makarichev. Though many Russians in Estonia outwardly wanted to show that what Russia did had nothing to do with them, he claims many still support Russia's foreign policies behind closed doors. That leads to division, both between native Estonians and Russians, and within the Russian community living in Estonia. The derussification keeps coming. In February 2023, Estonia's government tabled a proposal to unfreeze about $21 million of Russian assets in the country so the money could be used to support Ukraine. And speaking of support, Estonia has been just as ready to send aid to Ukraine as Latvia and Lithuania throughout the war. Assuming it follows through on its plans, Estonia will have provided $1.29 billion in military and citizen aid to Ukraine by the end of 2027. Oh, and it's also joined Latvia and Lithuania in calling Russia's invasion a genocide. Russia can see all of this happening, and it isn't happy about it. In February 2024, it announced that it had placed several Baltic states' officials on a wanted list for destroying monuments to Soviet soldiers within their borders. These officials include Kaja Kallas, Estonia's Prime Minister, and the Lithuanian Culture Minister Simonas Karis. However, this seems to be a hollow threat. Though Russia has called the vague notion of destroying monuments a crime against the memory of the world's liberators from Nazism and fascism, it hasn't mentioned what charges, if any, those on its wanted list would face. Furthermore, Russia has responded to the Baltic states' travel bans with bans of its own. March 24 saw the country deny entry to 347 Baltic citizens, many of whom are high-ranking officials, or were formerly officials, in their home countries, citing hostile policy as the reason. It's attempting to fight fire with fire. But the reality is that Moscow has to look at a trio of countries that are among the most vocal in the world when it comes to condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine. The Baltic states are derussifying at a rapid pace, which brings us back to the question that opened this video. Why? The answer, at least partially, lies in the history the Baltic countries have with Russia. The memory of Soviet oppression is still fresh in the minds of many in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. It's only been 34 years since those countries were able to reclaim the independence that was taken away from them in the early 1940s, and there are still many in all three countries that can remember what life was like under Russian rule. Those scars are still fresh for many in the Baltic states. And it's the freshness of those scars that brings us to the main reason for derussification. None of the three want it to happen again. The Baltic states have been warning the rest of Europe about Russia and its intentions long before Putin decided to invade Ukraine. Sky News reports that 2 decades of warnings have gone ignored by NATO. The rest of Europe was more focused on the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan than they were on the developing situation between Russia and Ukraine in the 2000s and 2010s. This period also saw many countries in Europe, including Great Britain, reducing their stockpile of weapons that were seen as holdovers of the Cold War. Sky says that the UK in particular decommissioned tanks and reduced its stockpiles of ammo and artillery following the Soviet Union's collapse under the mistaken belief that the threat of a conventional war in Europe no longer existed. Even Russia's invasion and capture of Crimea, a precursor to the conflict we see now, didn't do enough to convince the rest of Europe that Putin presented a clear danger to Europe. All the while, the Baltic states were sounding alarms that were going unheard, resulting in the rest of Europe being shocked by Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. At least that's the opinion of Radoslaw Sikorski. As former Polish foreign minister, he spoke to Politico about the warnings that Poland and the Baltic states tried to issue to NATO over the 20 years before Russia's invasion. He notes that the nations to the east, those that border Russia or are close to it, ran into brick walls whenever they pled with NATO for increased troop deployments in their territory. Sikorski notes that they were all ignored when they started drawing attention to Russia's campaign of cyber attacks. Sometimes Sikorski took things further, such as when he compared the 2006 Nord Stream gas pipeline project between Russia and Germany to the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that divided his country between the Soviet Union and the Nazis. Sikorski may have gone a little too far with that comparison, but the sentiment was clear. Europe was ignoring the growing Russian threat. The Western Europeans pooh-poohed and patronized us for 30 years, he told Politico. They were patronizing us about our attitude. Oh, you know, you over-nervous, oversensitive Central Europeans are prejudiced against Russia. But perhaps that wasn't the case. Rather than Poland and the Baltics being prejudiced against Russia, they were instead issuing warnings because they understood Russia better than any other countries in Europe. All have been subject to the country's territorial claims, especially during the Soviet Union era, and perhaps they saw something in Putin's policies that nobody else did. Now they're in a position where they can say, "We told you so," to the rest of Europe and by extension NATO. And it's not like these warnings were unfounded. In 2007, Estonia's computer servers were hit with a massive distributed denial of service or DDoS attack that shut down private and public websites in the country. Estonia was essentially shut down for several weeks, with that shutdown leading to the deployment of around 1 million zombie computers that could help the attackers spy on Estonia's computing network. Estonia was convinced that Russia organized the attacks. But just as Sikorski says, they were met with patronizing comments by the rest of Europe. That's according to Thomas Hendrik Ilves, Estonia's president at the time, who claims that the country's NATO allies told him that he didn't know what he was talking about and that he was simply being Russophobic. But the reality seems to be that these countries were seeing and reporting Russian warning shots, with their reports ultimately falling on deaf ears. It was only when Russia took the more direct action of invading an entire country that Europe and NATO started to pay attention. The Baltic states hope that both now have changed attitudes. That's because they see the risk that comes with a Russian victory in Ukraine. Should Putin succeed, they believe the odds are high that he's going to turn his attention to them. After all, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia have all been Russian territory before. To the Baltic countries, their efforts to de-Russify send a clear message to Putin that they don't want anything to do with him, Russia, or his efforts to strengthen his own country. But they also send a message to the Baltics' allies. We warned you about this before. Do something about Russia now, or we, and the rest of Europe by extension, may face even bigger problems in the future. Pro-Russian parties in these three states are now practically obsolete. All three are determined to keep Russians out and showcase their support for Ukraine. To the Baltics, the results of the war in Ukraine doesn't solely affect Ukraine, it affects them, and if the result doesn't go their way, they could be next in Moscow's firing line. But what do you think about the Baltic states and their de-Russification? Is it a justified response to Russia's actions that not only signals the Baltic states' desire to stay independent, but also highlights how much of a threat Russia poses to the three countries it used to rule? Or are the Baltic states making a huge fuss about nothing, as NATO and the EU seem to believe before the Ukraine crisis, and that Putin will stop once he has Ukraine? In a world already on edge, Putin's latest gambit, a ramp-up of tactical nuclear weapons drills, sends shivers down the spine. Amidst the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, this chilling announcement serves as a stark warning to the West. But what's behind this sudden escalation? Is it mere posturing, or is there a genuine threat that Russia could unleash nuclear chaos if Western boots, such as those from France, land on Ukrainian soil? Strap in as we dive into the dark heart of this nuclear standoff to uncover the truths that lie behind the surface. Let's unravel the reality behind Russia's nuclear threats. Russia's Ministry of Defense said the exercise will be done to practice the issues of preparation and use of non-strategic nuclear weapons. Non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons have no official definition, but they are generally low-yield arms of shorter range designed to be used against enemy forces on the battlefield rather than against large population centers. They are often forward deployed to bases and may come in the form of not just bombs, but torpedoes, artillery, or even mines. Russia has about 1,558 tactical nuclear weapons, according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. While it is modernizing these weapons, NATO's conventional superiority and Western military aid are challenging Russia's position. Despite mounting losses in Ukraine and strategic disadvantages, Moscow's emphasis on its nuclear forces highlights its struggle to maintain parity. The resilience and strategic advancements of Ukraine, supported by Western technology and aid, continue to pose significant challenges to Russia. Russia's tactical nuclear weapons include an estimated 784 in its navy. These come mostly in the form of cruise missiles. There are about 334 in its air force, mostly delivered by bombers, though some fighter aircraft, like the Su-57, are also thought to be capable of using them. The remainder consists of ground-launched missiles. The nuclear exercises will include missile forces in Russia's southern military district, which is headquartered at Rostov-on-Don, and covers the battlefields in eastern and southern Ukraine. The Russian Navy and aerospace forces will participate in the drills. But why would Russia resort to an exercise in the use of these weapons at this particular time? After all, 2024 has mostly been good for the Russian cause in Ukraine, if you count minor territorial gains at the cost of tens of thousands of casualties to be a good thing. These results were good enough for Vladimir Putin, at least, for him to be re-elected as the president of Russia with no difficulty, so the idea that Russian elites dissatisfied with the war would oust him from power is a more distant prospect now. But the summer might be better for Ukraine. Russia has only been as successful as it has this year because of Ukraine's ammunition shortages. In April, Christopher Cavoli, the highest-ranking American general in Europe, mentioned that Russia was firing 5 times as many shells as Ukraine. That's now about to change. In February, the Czech Republic announced that it had identified 800,000 available artillery shells in non-Western countries. The next month, the Czechs found an additional 700,000 shells. Western powers soon began purchasing both sets. In the next couple of months, these shells will arrive in bulk on the Ukrainian battlefields. In April, the United States Congress passed an aid package for the first time in 6 months. Worth $61 billion for Ukraine in total, the bill includes $14 billion worth of weapons and ammunition shipments for the Ukrainian military, including artillery shells and ATACMS missiles. These developments put much further pressure on the Russian military, and on April 21st, the Institute for the Study of War suggested that it would try its best to make the most of the closing window of opportunity. Russian forces will likely intensify ongoing offensive operations and missile and drone strikes in the coming weeks in order to exploit the closing window of Ukrainian materiel constraints. To add to the notion of a closing window of opportunity for Russia, Western leaders have been more adamant in their rhetoric that Putin's invasion not be allowed to succeed, even if it means loosening the constraints on the Ukrainian military. French President Emmanuel Macron was the most prominent such leader. In February, shortly after the fall of Avdiivka, he refused to rule out the idea that Europe should send troops to Ukraine. Macron argued that other taboos had not been broken before. Many people who say never never today were the same people who said never tanks, never planes, never long-range missiles 2 years ago. Let us have the humility to note that we have often been 6 to 12 months late. If you're a regular viewer of us here at the Military Show, then you know that truth is often stranger than fiction. But what do you do when you need a way to keep track of both? Well, we've found a solution, and that's why we're so excited to tell you about the sponsor of today's video, World Anvil. Designed to support creators from all walks of life, whether you're a writer, artist, streamer, game designer, historian, or hobbyist. Their powerful tools help you break down, organize, visualize, and plan out your creative endeavors. With features like interactive maps, chronicles, timelines, and newly enhanced diplomacy webs. Are you an RPG game master? World Anvil supports over 45 systems including D&D 5e, or you can create your own. While players will love World Anvil's extensive character management system, featuring character sheets, journals, inventory management, and spellbooks. But what if you're a writer who wants to create your own universe? With 25 world-building article templates, you can create wiki-style presentations of your world, making it easier than ever to write, organize, and even publish your stories. What we found most impressive, though, are the interactive maps and chronicles feature that allow you to plot events across time and space, truly bringing your narrative to life. Plus, with the new major update to timelines, organizing complex scenes, scenarios, and events has never been simpler. Ready to start forging your own world? Just go to worldanvil.com or use the link in the description, and be sure to use the code MilitaryShow to get 51% off any yearly subscription, giving you access to all the incredible features World Anvil has to offer. Again, that's worldanvil.com, and use the code MilitaryShow to start exploring, creating, and sharing with World Anvil right now. Macron also mentioned in his recent appearances that Russia was the sole aggressor and that Europe would need to do whatever it could to ensure that it did not come out of the war as the victor. More recent comments by other leaders suggested that the West's attitude was shifting toward letting the Ukrainians be more aggressive with the weapons they received. On May 2nd, British Foreign Secretary David Cameron promised nearly $4 billion of annual unilateral aid to Ukraine for as long as the war would last. Importantly, he added that Britain would have no problem with Ukraine using British weapons to attack targets on Russian soil. He said that such a move would be part of Ukraine's right to defend itself, and particularly appropriate given Russia's conduct inside Ukrainian territory. Such long-range weapons would include the British Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missile, which can hit targets at least 155 miles away, though experts believe they might be able to go longer. These weapons are ideal for striking vital military assets deep behind enemy lines, such as command and control centers or supply depots. Ukraine has successfully demonstrated its ability to use these missiles in Crimea as part of a campaign that has forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet to retreat from its traditional base at Sevastopol. Its most notable success was the damaging of the Russian submarine Rostov-na-Don on September 23rd. On April 23rd, the British government pledged additional Storm Shadows as part of the largest aid package it ever passed for Ukraine. Worth $622 million in total, the British package includes 1,600 offensive and defensive missiles, including more Storm Shadows. France pledged its version of the Storm Shadow, called Scalp, shortly afterward. As this rhetoric and news of additional Western military aid was heating up, the Russian government warned that the talk of sending NATO troops to Ukraine amounted to a new round of escalation, and in March, Putin said that it would be a short step to World War III from that perspective, a war he insisted no one wanted. In the first half of 2023, NATO also held its largest exercises since the Cold War, called Steadfast Defender, which practiced the deployment and cooperation of all alliance members across the Atlantic and the length and breadth of the European continent. This operation, too, saw a loud protest from Russia. Russia was making incremental and costly gains when Ukraine was suffering a severe shortage of weapons and ammunition. That situation will no longer be the case in the second half of the year, putting much greater pressure on Putin, who can now expect far higher losses. To answer the question of whether Putin would resort to using nuclear weapons in the presence of French troops, as Macron hinted though, we first need to look at Russia's nuclear doctrine. Russia's official nuclear doctrine permits the use of such weapons in the event of an enemy attack using weapons of mass destruction or conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is threatened. Like the American nuclear football, the briefcase with the Russian nuclear launch controls, called the Cheget, is with the President of the Russian Federation at all times. Russia's defense minister and chief of general staff have their own nuclear briefcases. The Cheget allows the president to communicate with the top military commanders and to the related nuclear forces via the Kazbek command and control network. In 2019, Russia's state Zvezda television channel revealed footage of what it said was the Cheget. In a section called Command, there were two buttons, the white launch button and the red cancel button. Like in the United States, the president has the sole authority to order a nuclear attack. If Putin thought that Russia was coming under a serious enough threat, he would be able to send a launch order to the Russian military, which would quickly reach its nuclear forces. If necessary, Russia has a dead hand or perimeter computer network that could carry out the order on an automated basis. Although Russia's official nuclear doctrine would seem to renounce the idea of a first strike, this is not the case. During the 1980s, the Soviet Union adopted an official no first use policy with regards to nuclear weapons, but this was never truly sincere. For example, the Soviets considered launching a preemptive nuclear attack during NATO's Able Archer 83 exercise. In 1993, the new Russian Federation officially dropped the no first use policy. Meanwhile, since Russia is a dictatorship anyway, official laws and policy count for little. If Putin wills it, there will be a nuclear strike. There is no countermanding authority that would stop him from launching an attack if he was dead set on it. Indeed, some hardliners in Russia want Putin to loosen the country's nuclear doctrine, although he said last year that he saw no reason to make a change. Putin's latest nuclear comments and news of the exercises were met with relative ambivalence in Ukraine and in the West, as have his other overtures to nuclear weapons since the war began. Andriy Yusov, an official with Ukraine's military intelligence, said that nuclear blackmail is a constant practice of Putin's regime in response. Indeed, such practices have been common since the start of the war. Days after the invasion began, Putin ordered his nuclear forces to be put on a state of special alert. This was likely an attempt to discourage the West from supporting Ukraine with weapons and money. That obviously didn't work. In September 2022, as Russian forces were in retreat in the face of Ukraine's counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson oblasts, Putin boasted that Russia had unrivaled weapons of mass destruction and that he would use any means available to defend the homeland. "I'm not bluffing," Putin insisted. As if to make the matter clearer, Putin decided to deploy some of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus in the summer of 2023. Old Soviet bases built for the purpose of hosting such weapons were reactivated. None of these nuclear-related actions had any effect on the war, though, either on the battlefield or on the diplomatic front. This is why Putin's latest round of nuclear saber-rattling hasn't made much of an impression on anyone. But what if Macron followed up on his rhetoric and French troops got involved? Would this unlikely event make Putin's nuclear threats more than just talk? One must admit that the presence of French troops on Ukraine's soil would be a significant new development in the war. How would Putin react? Would he consider it an existential threat? First, we must note that the presence of French troops alone would not necessarily mean the escalation of the war in Ukraine into World War III. NATO is a defensive alliance only. The North Atlantic Treaty does not obligate its members to assist one another if one of them takes part in an overseas expedition on its own initiative. Suppose Macron and the French government decided to send some troops to reinforce Ukraine. That would be a decision from Paris alone. If the French intended to take such unilateral action, they would not be able to rely on their NATO allies to come to the defense of their forces in Ukraine. The lack of involvement from the rest of NATO may convince Putin that Russia is not under existential threat and need not use nuclear weapons in retaliation. There would also be another consideration. Although Russia has isolated itself from much of the world with its decision to invade Ukraine, it nevertheless depends on a series of relationships with other countries in order to keep its economy afloat, its forces supplied, and its society running. Breaking the nuclear taboo would put these relationships under strain. North Korea likely wouldn't care and continue supplying Russia with artillery shells and other weapons, but the relationship with Pyongyang isn't exactly the most important one. Three relationships in particular have been of pivotal interest for a warring Russia. The first of these is with Turkey. Turkey has sold weapons to Ukraine, particularly its Bayraktar TB2 drone. It's also closed the Dardanelles and Bosporus to the ships of the Russian Navy, in line with the 1936 Montreux Convention, preventing the Russian Black Sea Fleet from being reinforced. Nevertheless, Turkey has not been as severe with Russia as the rest of its NATO allies. Turkey has avoided joining the Western sanctions regime and has become the fourth largest customer for Russian energy exports. In the pre-war years, Turkey attempted to use its relationship with Russia as part of a strategy of geopolitical hedging. Despite Turkey's insistence that Crimea be returned to Ukraine and tensions with Russia in Syria, it attempted to maintain good relations. The best example was its decision to purchase the S-400 air defense system, in a move which brought American sanctions and its exclusion from the F-35 program. For Turkey, though, fostering the relationship with Russia was a way to balance against the West. Since the West was opposed to some of Turkey's moves in the Middle East, particularly against the Kurds, hedging with Russia was a matter of strategic importance for the government in Ankara. There are also certain ideological ties. Under the leadership of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey has gone through a period of democratic backsliding and growing authoritarianism. Like Putin, Erdogan has been called a proponent of the civilization state theory, and he has grown Turkey's reach beyond its borders in moves which some experts call attempts at a neo-Ottoman foreign policy. Nevertheless, if Russia were to cross the nuclear threshold, it's hard to see how Turkey would be able to maintain the relationship. In a nuclear scenario, Turkey is particularly endangered, not just because of its geography and its membership in the NATO alliance, but because it hosts American tactical nuclear weapons on its soil. Keeping the nuclear genie in its lamp is in Turkey's best interests, and its failure to mount much greater opposition to Russia in that scenario would force the West's hand in dealing with the so-called odd man out of NATO. Russia using nuclear weapons would force Turkey to choose the West and completely shun Russia for its own economic survival. India is the second critical relationship for the post-invasion Russia. Indian purchases of Russian energy have helped Moscow to weather the storm of Western sanctions, and it's now Russia's third largest customer. India has had a long-running security relationship with Russia as well, with New Delhi keen to purchase weapons such as the S-400 and T-90 tank. However, India has been between something of a rock and a hard place with its relationship with Russia. It's traditionally a non-aligned country, but its primary national security challenge is from a more aggressive China. Such a challenge has drawn India steadily into the American foreign policy orbit, especially through the quadrilateral security dialogue. Deadly border clashes between 2020 and 2022 reinforce the importance of the relationship with the United States. India has so far successfully managed to walk the tightrope between the United States and Russia. Since countering China is also Washington's highest geopolitical priority, it's tolerated India's cozier relationship with Russia. However, all bets would be off in the event that Russia went nuclear in Ukraine. Like Turkey, India would almost certainly be forced to renounce its relationship with Russia for the sake of its trade with the much larger economies of the West and because of its national security interests. And what about China? The relationship with Beijing is by far Moscow's most important. China is now Russia's largest energy customer. It's also a critical source for electronic components and other vital goods that have been targeted by Western sanctions. Russian foreign reserves are now filled with Chinese currency thanks to the exploding trade between the two countries. Unfortunately for Russia, this currency isn't good for much other than trade, and because the economies of the West are now cut off, Moscow must keep trading with China to survive. It can't hedge its bets. China has understood this advantage and used it. Xi Jinping might agree with Putin in his attempts to undermine the US-led international order, but he has so far not been willing to provide military aid for fear of cutting off trade with the West. In a statement following Xi's summit with Putin in 2023, both leaders agreed that all nuclear powers should refrain from deploying such weapons beyond their national borders. Russia's deployment of tactical nukes to Belarus came only months later and may have been an attempt to break the mold that it's now the junior partner in the relationship. Russia's use of these weapons would be a completely different story. If Xi was reluctant to provide military aid for fear of upsetting trade relationships with the West before, Russia's use of nuclear weapons would leave him with little choice but to play a much more forceful hand against Russia. China's economy is already showing signs of trouble. It grew by only 3% in 2022, low by its standards, and has entered a general decline in growth since Xi took power. If Russia broke the nuclear taboo and China refused to join the world in imposing costs for such behavior, it would suffer severely from the severance of relations with the West, which are already under strain. For these reasons, the presence of French troops on Ukrainian soil would not necessarily lead to Putin using nuclear weapons, especially if they are small in number. However, if France launched a full-scale deployment, Russian forces in Ukraine would be in serious trouble. Russia has suffered enormously against a Ukrainian military that it is outnumbered and outgunned. It's reasonable to assume that a better equipped and better trained French force would do far more damage. In the face of Putin potentially being unable to win the war on a conventional basis, the temptation to use tactical nuclear weapons to turn the tide would increase. But France is a nuclear-armed nation, and so Putin would face the awful conundrum of losing the war and losing power, or facing nuclear retaliation and the loss of Russia's most important trading relationships. Hopefully in such a scenario, Russia's elite would decide to pack him off and ship him to an isolated dacha before anything too drastic comes to pass. The prospect of French intervention, especially without its allies, remains unlikely. Nevertheless, Macron's statements and Putin's latest round of nuclear saber-rattling show us how high the stakes are in the game of nations these days. After the end of the Cold War, the people of the world had high hopes that such things were behind them, but history never truly ends. What do you think Putin would do if France or another Western country decided to intervene unilaterally in Ukraine? Could this escalate to crossing the nuclear threshold? And what would be the consequences for Russia even without nuclear retaliation?
When Russia invaded Ukraine, the world watched, expecting Kyiv to fall within days under the might of the Russian army. But more than 2 years later, Ukraine has not only survived, but has bested Russia on multiple occasions. How did this happen? The answer lies in military aid from over 50 countries, with one European nation standing out: Germany. Germany, initially hesitant, has become Ukraine's strongest European ally, providing extensive financial aid, military training, advanced weaponry, humanitarian relief, and diplomatic support. Yet even this powerhouse's efforts seemed insufficient, so Germany devised a bold new strategy to help Ukraine indirectly but effectively. What is this secretive plan? How could it create a defensive shield over Ukraine and potentially turn the tide of the war? In this video, we'll unveil Germany's daring strategy to utilize NATO air defense systems, the geopolitical maneuvers behind this plan, and its long-term feasibility. Let's dive into Germany's plan and discover how this unexpected hero is reshaping the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Germany wants to utilize NATO air defense systems to shoot down Russian drones over the west of Ukraine, effectively creating a semblance of a no-fly zone in the area. Given how much Russian drones have decimated Ukrainian forces and civilian areas, this defensive shield should help turn the tides in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. But what would this defensive shield look like exactly? Well, it would cover some 43 miles of the Ukrainian territory, which would now become a safe zone under NATO's protection. The protection in question would come from the alliance's integrated air defense system units stationed in the neighboring countries of Poland and Romania. Of course, the primary reason for the involvement of these two countries is purely geographical. They're located to the west of Ukraine, precisely where the safe zone is to be established. The defense systems themselves would be placed as close to the Ukrainian border as possible. As Agnieszka Brugger, a member of the German Bundestag and the deputy chairwoman of the Alliance 90 in the Greens parliamentary group, puts it, it will be best to deploy air defense systems on the borders of countries that border Ukraine so they could also protect Ukraine's western regions. Anton Hofreiter, a fellow member of the Bundestag and the Alliance 90 in the Greens, was the one to specify that the said bordering countries should be Poland and Romania. His exact words were that the possibility of Ukrainian airspace being protected by systems located on the territory of Poland and Romania should not be ruled out in the long run. The long run part is especially important, given that Germany is yet to receive a green flag to enter Ukraine in this way. More on that later. For now, let's discuss how the idea of entering the Ukrainian airspace even came to be. It begins with the April 13, 2024 attack on Israel by Iran, which fired more than 300 missiles and armed drones at Israel. Despite that barrage, Israel managed to deflect much of the attack thanks to a multi-layered air defense system, which consisted of 170 drones, 110 ballistic missiles, and 30 cruise missiles. But that defense system itself isn't the primary reason Germany has contemplated installing an air defense system inside Ukraine. It was the response of Israel's allies that inspired German decision-makers to propose entering Ukrainian airspace. Israel's first layer of defense was the F-35 combat fighters. You're probably well familiar with this jet. After all, we're talking about arguably the most advanced fighter jets in the world. Originally, the F-35 Lightning II stealth fighter jets were produced by Lockheed Martin. They soon caught the attention of Israel, thanks to their advanced stealth and information processing capabilities, as well as an impressive supersonic speed of Mach 1.6. That's not to mention that these jets can carry up to 18,000 pounds of internal and external ordnance in what Lockheed Martin CEO Marilyn A. Hewson referred to as beast mode. So unsurprisingly, Israel became the first country after the US to acquire the F-35 jets, 50 of them to be precise. However, the country has since made significant changes to the model, manufacturing its own wings and electronic warfare system. The subsequent Israeli F-35 variant was named Adir, meaning the mighty one in Hebrew. The jet's might was on full display in April 2024 when these technological marvels were sent to intercept projectiles launched from the territories of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. The F-35s reportedly managed to take out 25 of the 30 cruise missiles outside Israeli airspace. Now, sending fighter jets to intercept missiles isn't always possible. This decision is made based on speed, altitude, and trajectory of the incoming threat, as well as the capabilities of the available air defense systems. But since the projectiles coming at Israel were sent from relatively far away, there was time for the F-35s to take flight. Interestingly, some of the Iranian projectiles were seemingly targeting the Nevatim airbase, which houses the Israeli F-35 variants in the first place. This just goes to show the strategic value Israel and Iran places on its F-35 fleet and the effectiveness of these advanced fighters in countering threats. But mighty as they are, the F-35s couldn't possibly counter all the projectiles sent Israel's way. That's where Israel's long-standing multi-layered defense system took over. Layer number 1, the upper layer, consists of Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 ballistic missile defense systems. The goal of this layer is to intercept medium to long-range missiles. Layer number 2, the middle layer, is the so-called David's Sling. This innovative defense solution tackles short to medium-range ballistic missiles and larger caliber rockets. It's designed to strike the targets directly, shooting them down from as far as 186 miles away from Israel. And layer number 3, the bottom layer, is the famed Iron Dome. This mobile system defends Israel against short-range surface-to-surface rockets and unmanned aerial vehicles, aka drones. Iron Dome is the first missile defense system of its kind, and it's highly capable of handling multiple incoming threats at once, which it successfully proved in April. This system is the primary reason none of the 170 drones sent by Iran hit their targets. But as mentioned, the Israeli air defense capabilities weren't the only reason it was able to thwart the Iranian attack. The US, UK, Jordan, and France also came to Israel's rescue. The US downed over 80 drones and at least 6 ballistic missiles, according to the US Central Command, or CENTCOM. Even more impressively, some of these projectiles were destroyed before even taking flight from the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. The rest were intercepted over southern Syria. The US also provided vital intelligence that armed Israel with the necessary knowledge to take out all the threats coming its way. As for the UK, the country's Royal Air Force Typhoon combat jets downed an undisclosed number of Iranian drones. The same goes for Jordan, undoubtedly the most surprising ally to Israel. The country used its advanced radar systems, air-to-air missiles, and F-16 supersonic fighter jets to fend off the Iranian attack. Though to be fair, the reason Jordan got involved appears to be more self-serving. The Iranian projectiles had to enter Jordanian airspace to get to Israel, so essentially Jordan was defending its country and citizens, not Israel. According to Brian Kachulis, a senior fellow of US foreign policy at the Middle East Institute, this move sends a clear message that Jordan and Israel have this shared interest in making sure that the airspace in their territory is defended. This leaves us with France, which did take part in Israel's defense, but primarily contributed by patrolling the country's airspace. As a result of this joint action, only a handful of the initially launched projectiles managed to reach Israeli territory, and it was only the ballistic missiles which managed to inflict minor damage near a runway at the Nevatim Air Base and to a road nearby. Though the plan was to paralyze the base and thus damage Israel's air capabilities, Iran failed miserably, as the Nevatim base remained operational after and even throughout the attack. That cooperative system is what inspired German military experts Nico Lange and Lieutenant General Heinrich Braus to put forward the idea of establishing air defense in bordering countries and in Ukraine. Seeing what can happen when allies come together to defend an impacted airspace, the German parliament members, or MPs, brought Lange and Braus's notion of Germany and NATO doing the same for Ukraine. Perhaps surprisingly, even the opposing political forces, the Greens, the Free Democratic Party, and the Christian Democratic Union, agreed that this was a good idea. Roderich Kieswetter of the Christian Democratic Union pointed out that this joint action would ease the burden on the Ukrainian air defense and allow it to protect the front. He also mentioned the April attack on Israel as an example, emphasizing that the allies involved in Israel's defense didn't automatically become parties to the conflict. Unfortunately, this argument, as well as the unexpected unity in the Bundestag, wasn't enough to sway the German government to take direct military action in support of Ukraine. This means that Germany isn't allowed to enter the Ukrainian airspace, at least for now. The mere fact that this proposition was even discussed by the Bundestag and attracted so much attention suggests that Germany is reconsidering its role in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict and pushing the boundaries of its commitment to collective defense. If you remember, Bundestag member Anton Hofreiter, who we mentioned earlier, saw this plan being carried out in the long run, so Germany's role in the conflict is likely to continue to evolve. But why hasn't Germany already taken this decisive action to enter the Ukrainian airspace? Well, there are multiple hurdles standing in the way of this historic action. We've already briefly brushed on the first and arguably the most important one. Germany is simply scared that entering Ukraine, even indirectly, would trigger an all-out war with Russia. And let's be honest, a direct conflict with Russia is the last thing Germany would want, especially when both world wars Germany had previously fought against Russia ended disastrously for Germany. And Germany isn't the only one with concerns about escalations. Fear of a greater conflict is also the reason why the US and the UK refused to protect the Ukrainian airspace in the same way they defended the Israeli airspace. The UK's Foreign Secretary David Cameron put it bluntly, saying that deploying NATO forces even indirectly might lead to escalation in terms of a wider European war. Never one to fear an adversary, the US explained its refusal to get involved in a slightly different way. When asked about protecting the Ukrainian airspace with the US defense systems, the White House National Security Council's Strategic Communications Coordinator, John Kirby, pointed out the difference between the Ukrainian and Israeli scenarios. He summed up his difference in 7 words: different conflicts, different airspace, different threat patterns. And to be fair, Kirby's right. Protecting Ukraine would be significantly more challenging than defending Israel from a purely military perspective. Ukraine shares a longer border with Russia, and the conflict zone is vast, with multiple fronts and shifting battle lines. This makes it difficult to establish a clear and secure airspace over Ukraine, especially given Russia's air defense systems and military capabilities. But let's say Germany and other Ukrainian allies move past this fear and commit to protecting Ukrainian airspace at all costs. Is this protection even feasible in the long run? As things currently stand, the answer is a resounding no. Remember, the Iranian attack on Israel was an isolated incident, while protecting the Ukrainian airspace would be an ongoing and complex operation, one that the European allies simply don't have enough air defense systems to sustain. As Markus Faber of Germany's Free Democratic Party pointed out, there are a limited number of air defense systems and missiles available. So for Germany to even think about defending Ukraine's airspace against Russia, it would first have to secure more defense systems. Only under those circumstances would it be possible to deploy Western air defense systems to protect the sky over Ukraine. And let's face it, Ukraine is no Israel. The country doesn't have the groundbreaking Iron Dome or state-of-the-art F-35s. The country waited for what it seems like forever to even get its hands on the few dozen F-16s it does now have. Throw the damage inflicted by Russia in the months of conflict into the mix, and you'll understand why protecting the Ukrainian airspace would be simply overwhelming. It becomes even more worrisome when you consider that Russian drones seem to keep coming. The country is going all in on so-called kamikaze drones designed to carry explosives, loiter around the target for quite some time, and then crash into it. At first, Russia imported these drones from Iran, opting for the Hesse Shahed 136 models. Since the beginning of the invasion, Russia has reportedly fired over 4,500 of these destructive drones at Ukrainian targets. But it gets worse. Russia plans to produce 6,000 of these drones at domestic production facilities by the summer of 2025, which doesn't bode well for Ukraine's already weakened air defense. Of course, Ukraine isn't standing idly by. The country's own drones are getting smarter in an effort to dodge Russia's jamming signals. This allows Ukraine to carry out more effective defensive measures while underscoring the country's continual efforts to adapt to the evolving threat posed by Russia. But how long can Ukraine go on its own? Certainly not for too long. The country's drone interception rates are already decreasing drastically, mostly due to the sheer volume of drones being deployed by Russia. Will this be enough to prompt Germany to go through with entering Ukraine? For now it seems plausible, but it's still not close to fruition. Russia has already accused Germany of entering the Ukraine war, so the country might just as well get directly involved. The accusation came in March 2024, in the aftermath of a leaked conversation between top German officials. Believe it or not, these officials discussed war plans on an unsecured phone line, thus breaking the fundamental protocols of secure communication. Unsurprisingly, Russia managed to intercept this call. The call was then recorded and leaked via Russia Today, the country's state-controlled media outlet. During the call, the German officials discussed the possibility of sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine and the potential impact of this move on the war. A potential target of these missiles would be the highly protected Crimean bridge connecting Russia to Crimea. As a response to the leaked conversation, Russia summoned German ambassador Alexander Graf Lambsdorff and registered an official protest. The country saw this conversation as proof that Germany was indeed trying to enter the war in Ukraine, questioning whether German Chancellor Olaf Scholz had lost control over his country and parliament. Russia's response also clearly defined their red lines when it comes to Germany's involvement in Ukraine. Even sending the Taurus missiles would mean Germany is entering the war, which would likely prompt Russia to respond accordingly. But what is it about these Taurus missiles that makes them such a threat to Russia? It's simple, really. The Taurus missiles, jointly developed by Germany and Sweden, are considered one of the most advanced weapon systems in use today. This missile is about 16.5 feet long, weighs 1.4 tons, and can be fired from the air via fighter jets. When fired, it travels at speeds of up to 727 miles per hour, almost the speed of sound, and locates targets that are as far as 300 miles away. Plus, this long-range missile flies at low altitude, only about 114 feet, which makes it nearly impossible to detect with radars. Germany uses Taurus missiles to tackle high-value targets, such as enemy command posts and bunkers. Taurus missiles can penetrate several reinforced concrete walls before the actual warhead explodes, which makes bunkers susceptible to their power. Currently, Germany has around 600 Taurus missiles, 150 of which are ready for deployment. But as things stand, Ukraine won't see a single one of these valuable missiles. Even before the leaked call, Scholz was adamant about not sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and he stood firm on this stance time and again. Why? Because of a deep-seated fear of Russia, according to many experts. Though he describes his stance as prudence and not weakness, it's abundantly clear that he believes that supplying Ukraine with this weapon would provoke Putin to such a degree that he would likely retaliate against Germany. So if you're keeping score, that's two things Germany can't do to directly help Ukraine. It can't enter its airspace or send game-changing missiles. And of course, it also can't enter Ukraine in the conventional way, by sending troops. But this isn't surprising. Since the very beginning of the Russian invasion, NATO allies reiterated that no troops would be sent to Ukraine. After all, the country isn't a NATO member, which severely limits the alliance's formal obligations to provide military support. The idea of sending troops to Ukraine became a point of controversy due to a statement made by French President Emmanuel Macron in February 2024. Macron stated there is no consensus today to send ground troops officially, but nothing is ruled out. He then added, "We will do whatever it takes to ensure that Russia cannot win this war." Of course, these statements sent shockwaves across Europe. Macron didn't seem too fazed as he reaffirmed this possibility in May 2024. His exact words were, "I'm not ruling anything out because we are facing someone who is not ruling anything out." But unlike Macron, Scholz did rule out this possibility, loud and clear. Scholz said there will be no ground troops, no soldiers on Ukrainian soil who are sent there by European states or NATO states. NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg shared the same sentiment, emphasizing that there are no plans for NATO combat troops on the ground in Ukraine. This raises the total to 3 things Germany can't do for Ukraine. But just because Germany can't enter Ukraine just yet doesn't mean it's leaving the country to fend for itself. If you remember, we mentioned that Germany is Ukraine's single largest donor in Europe. So rather than dwelling on all the things Germany can't do, let's review what the country can do, and has done so far. Number 1. Provide military aid. Germany might not be able or willing to send Taurus missiles to Ukraine, but this in no way lessens the sheer amount of military aid the country has sent so far. If we're talking numbers, Germany has spent approximately $1.7 billion on military assistance to Ukraine in 2022 and $5.3 billion in 2023. So far in 2024, Germany announced plans to ramp up military aid for Ukraine by another $4.1 billion. And this comes after the Bundestag approved a staggering $8.2 billion in military assistance for Kyiv in 2024. But how is this money being spent? Germany's financial commitment to Ukraine is channeled into various crucial areas that significantly enhance Ukraine's defensive capabilities. This includes some $300 million spent on training over 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers in Germany. It also covers the advanced weaponry and equipment Germany sent to Ukraine. The money either accounts for the replacement of weapons sent from the stockpiles of the Bundeswehr, Germany's armed forces, or the country's defense industry deliverables. Though Germany's military aid for Ukraine covers virtually all combat areas, assistance in the Air Defense Department probably interests you the most, given the topic of the video. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion, Germany has sent a range of sophisticated air defense systems to Ukraine, significantly enhancing the country's ability to protect its skies. This includes 2 Skynex air defense systems with ammunition, 500 Stinger man-portable air defense systems, and 2,700 Strela man-portable air defense systems. But there are 2 air defense systems that made the biggest difference: the Iris and Patriot defense systems. So far, Germany has sent 4 Iris-T SLM and 2 Iris-T SLS air defense systems to Ukraine, together with their corresponding missiles. The SLM variant tackles short-range missiles up to 7.5 miles of range and 5 miles of altitude. The SLS variant deals with medium-range missiles, having a maximum range of roughly 25 miles and a maximum altitude of 12.4 miles. So far, these systems have reportedly had a 100% success kill rate in Ukraine, even when faced with the notorious kamikaze drones. As for the Patriot air defense system, Germany has sent 2 of these systems to Ukraine so far, with the corresponding missiles included. Compared to the Iris system, the Patriot air defense offers a broader range of capabilities and enhanced performance. It's designed to counter high-speed, high-altitude threats such as ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as advanced aircraft. From this description alone, it's easy to understand why Ukraine relies on these air defense systems so immensely, especially given how lackluster the country's native systems are. But 2 Patriot systems aren't nearly enough. According to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, the country needs at least 25 to successfully defend its territory. Germany only plans to give 1 more system in the future, but at least it's going all out on missiles, announcing a shipment of 100 Patriot air defense missiles in June 2024. Number 2. The use of German weapons against targets in Russia. This might be the closest Germany will come to directly entering the Russo-Ukrainian conflict so far. In May 2024, the country authorized Ukraine to hit some targets on Russian soil using the weapons Germany is supplying. This authorization came right after the US did the same, which was seen as a groundbreaking policy change. Ukraine was allowed to use these weapons to defend the border region of Kharkiv, 12 miles from Russia, which has been mercilessly attacked by Russian forces throughout May. With 2 of the most direct military involvement measures out of the way, let's quickly list other ways in which Germany has helped Ukraine since 2022. Number 3, it's imposed massive and unprecedented sanctions on Russia, hoping to financially dismantle the country's almighty war machine. Number 4. Germany has sent massive amounts of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, ensuring that medical care, food, and clean water reach the Ukrainian people quickly. Number 5. Germany has provided direct financial aid to Ukraine to allow the country to stabilize its financial systems amidst the ongoing conflict. Number 6. German high-ranking officials have tirelessly pleaded with other allies to send more aid to Ukraine, placing special emphasis on air defense. Though these pleas have seemingly failed to secure the crucial air defense systems, many countries have been making smaller pledges in response to Germany's efforts. According to the German Ministry of Defense, the following countries have promised to send additional aid as a direct response to the country's efforts: Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Lithuania, Norway, the Netherlands, Romania, Spain, the UK, and the US. Number 7. Germany has vowed to help rebuild Ukraine and is already planning national and international short-term and long-term support. Number 8. Germany has been actively helping refugees from Ukraine, supporting them financially and protecting them socially. And number 9. Germany has supported the efforts of the International Criminal Court to document the war crimes Russia committed in Ukraine, both financially and by directly collecting evidence. This extensive list leaves us with a single question: from where does Germany's tremendous willingness to help Ukraine come? Some experts see this support as a result of Germany's commitment to international law and human rights, as well as basic sympathy for the Ukrainian people. However, the more pragmatic analysts point to a combination of strategic, economic, and political factors that drive Germany's extensive support for Ukraine. Chief among them is the fear that if Ukraine falls, the rest of Europe will follow suit. As German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock put it, ultimately it's about one thing: supporting Ukraine keeps the war away from us. Of course, there are also those who claim that Germany simply can't seem to shake its World War II guilt, which fuels its foreign policy decisions and a remarkable commitment to peace and stability. But what camp are you in? Why do you believe Germany is helping Ukraine so extensively? And do you see the country entering Ukraine directly or indirectly anytime soon? To the outside world, Kaliningrad is simply part of Russia. It's the country's furthest western exclave, meaning it's essentially Putin's gateway to the rest of Europe. And before the war in Ukraine, it was home to a substantial Russian military presence. But the winds of change are blowing in Kaliningrad. The region is evolving from being an important part of Russia, especially in terms of its access to the Baltic Sea, into the potential catalyst for a war that may engulf the Baltic states and, by extension, the rest of Europe. Kaliningrad is on the verge of becoming Ukraine 2.0. And as with any sequel, the possibility is that the fight over and in Kaliningrad could be bigger, scarier, and more all-encompassing than the battle in Ukraine has been so far. At its worst, Kaliningrad could become the unwitting trigger for World War III. How? That's the question we aim to answer in this video. But before we dive into what makes Kaliningrad such an important scrap of territory, it's worth learning a little more about what it is and, crucially, what it represents to Russia. Kaliningrad's history dates back to 1255 and the rise of the Teutonic Order. In their quest to Christianize as much of Europe as possible, that order took the territory that would become Kaliningrad as part of the Baltic Crusades. Naming it Königsberg, the territory soon became home to thousands of German settlers who spent the next few centuries setting up in Königsberg and establishing it as a separate state. Still, that state had a heavy Germanic influence, meaning it was never truly independent. And that lack of independence was exacerbated by the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Königsberg was essentially absorbed into East Prussia during this period, with Germany maintaining direct control over the region throughout both world wars. That's where the Soviet Union comes into play. After the Soviet Union played its part in defeating the Axis powers and ending World War II, it took part in the creation of the Potsdam Agreement. That agreement set new territorial boundaries within Europe, with Königsberg officially passing into Soviet hands. With 1946 came annexation and the region being split between Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, the former also being under the full or partial Soviet control at the time, and it was rechristened Kaliningrad in honor of the former head of the Soviet state, Mikhail Kalinin. For the next 45 years, Kaliningrad essentially functioned as an exclave of the Soviet Union. The region was turned into an oblast, an administrative division of the Soviet Union and later Russia, and Moscow banned access to the territory for foreigners. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought with it new possibilities for Kaliningrad, though any hopes of it becoming an independent territory were soon dashed when Moscow retained its control over the exclave. It retained its position as an oblast, with control over the region proving crucial to Russia.
Not only could Kaliningrad serve as its furthest western territory in Europe, potentially leading to it serving a diplomatic purpose, but it also gave Moscow access to warm water ports during the winter. However, the separation between Kaliningrad and Russia started to become problematic. Kaliningrad is around 676 miles away from Moscow, and it's separated from Russia by both Lithuania and Poland, which encircle the territory. Everything that Russia does in Kaliningrad must go through one of those two countries, usually Lithuania first. It has access to the water thanks to its ports in St. Petersburg, but as those ports regularly freeze over during the winter, that access is somewhat restricted, often leaving Russia reliant on the cooperation of other countries to access Kaliningrad. Therein lies a problem for Moscow, as well as a hint toward one of the reasons why Kaliningrad is on the verge of becoming Ukraine 2.0. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kaliningrad has operated as a special economic zone, in which there are no import duties and extremely low taxes. That's allowed it to build economic ties with other European countries, including the Baltic states. It's heavily reliant on Moscow. 100 trains pass through Lithuania every month to supply Kaliningrad before the outbreak of the Ukraine war, but it also operates somewhat independently of Russia itself. That near independence leads us to the first reason why Kaliningrad is gearing up to become Ukraine 2.0. Many in the territory want it to become its own state. That was made clear during the National Online Referendum on Self-Determination of National Republics, held between February 16th and February 28th, 2023. The referendum was an online poll organized by several activist groups located within and outside of Russian territory. Its results were unofficial. Russia would never approve of such a poll, as even the concept of one of its oblasts wanting to gain independence is a potential sign of Russia's disintegration in the mind of President Vladimir Putin. Still, it happened, despite attempts to shut it down, and the results showed a clear design for independence inside Kaliningrad. A staggering 72.1% of the voters said they wanted freedom, compared to just 27.9% who said they wanted to remain part of Russia. Again, this was an unofficial poll, meaning it doesn't trigger anything that could lead to Kaliningrad actually gaining its independence, but it offers a clear answer to what some analysts dub the Kaliningrad question. The question is simple: what happens to Kaliningrad now that it's essentially isolated from Russia thanks to the Baltic states surrounding it not only becoming independent, but also becoming members of the European Union? The poll result is just the latest demonstration of the strength of a growing movement within Kaliningrad for the region to cut its ties with Russia. And it exemplifies the feeling of many within the territory that it's essentially an island, that it's not only cut off from Russia, but also hindered in efforts to build stronger relationships within Europe because of its ties to Moscow. That's the opinion of Alexei Shabunin, a journalist with a Kaliningrad news website named Russian West, who points out that those in the region who love Russia have always felt isolated. But now, with the outbreak of war in Ukraine, there is a general feeling of being locked in. The feeling is exacerbated by the fact that Russia has been more than happy to call on Kaliningrad's citizens to fight in Ukraine. According to the military newspaper Stars and Stripes, 5,000 of the 1 million people who live in Kaliningrad had been called up by December 2023, with 450 losing their lives. Outwardly, the exclave has also been supporting Russia's war efforts by providing clothes, camouflage nets, and quadcopters, in addition to providing a large portion of its 2024 budget to fund the war effort. But privately, Shabunin says most in the region just want it all to be over. People try to avoid the topic of the special military operation. They try to live like before. He also points to a lack of trust in the region's authorities, pointing out that many don't believe their leaders when they say they will defend Kaliningrad from being overrun if Russia declares war on the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Instead, they believe the exclave will be turned into rubble, undefended unless it's able to free itself from Russia and ally with the countries around it. We start to see a clear parallel between Kaliningrad and Ukraine here. Like Kaliningrad, Ukraine used to be under Soviet control. It was part of the Soviet Union for around 70 years before its 1991 collapse. After that, Ukraine gained its independence. Kaliningrad didn't. And if Ukraine's independence and Russia's desire to reclaim the territory was a trigger for the crisis we're seeing today, Kaliningrad's desire for independence could serve the same purpose. Should the exclave free itself from Russia, it might only be a matter of time before Putin, or whoever comes after him, attempts to reclaim it. Of course, it's not just Kaliningrad causing problems here. Lithuania will also play a role in Kaliningrad becoming Ukraine 2.0. Earlier we discussed how Kaliningrad is essentially locked away from Russia, with Lithuania having served as Moscow's main point of access for decades. That wasn't a problem before the Ukraine crisis. Russia was generally able to ensure the travel of both citizens and cargo through Lithuania and into Kaliningrad without issue. The war changed all of that. As a response to Russia's actions, Lithuania has repeatedly banned Russian travel through its territory. Its parliament voted to impose the Law on Imposing Restrictive Measures regarding the military aggression against Ukraine in 2023, creating a year-long ban on most Russian citizens from gaining visas to enter the country. The law was extended in April 2024 to run for at least another year, meaning Russia won't have ground-based access to Kaliningrad until, at best, May 2, 2025. Lithuania has also happily participated in the sanctions imposed on Russia since the outbreak of war. It's a clear supporter of Ukraine. It's provided about $500 million in financial aid to the country since February 2022, and it has its own history with Russia. Like Ukraine before it and Kaliningrad currently, Lithuania also fell under the Soviet yoke in the wake of World War II, only gaining its independence upon the collapse of the Soviet Union. In essence, it, along with the other Baltic states, has established itself as a clear enemy of Russia and Putin's aggressive tactics in Ukraine. It's also restricted access to Kaliningrad by preventing Russians from traveling to the oblast via land. They instead have to rely on a seaborne route from St. Petersburg, which is affected by the cold temperatures mentioned earlier. In the context of Kaliningrad becoming Ukraine 2.0, Lithuania's actions present two issues. First, they serve to further isolate Kaliningrad from Russia, which may have an interesting impact on the oblast's population. After all, there's already a clear and growing pro-independence movement. Given that Kaliningrad is supported directly by Russia, that movement could grow even larger as conditions deteriorate in the oblast. Its residents might increasingly feel that the prospect of essentially becoming a fourth Baltic state would serve it better. At least then it will be able to expand its relationships in Europe, perhaps to the point where it follows Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia in becoming a member of the EU and NATO. There's a major upside for Kaliningrad here, especially as Lithuania's sanctions and travel restrictions on Russia begin to cause more problems in the region. Second, Lithuania has angered Russia with this move, raising the possibility of Russia declaring war on it and the other Baltic states in response. That would lead to a somewhat indirect Ukraine 2.0 situation. Russia wouldn't be declaring war on Kaliningrad. It already owns the region, but it would declare war on the country that's preventing it from accessing that territory, potentially bringing the other Baltic nations into the fight, and due to Lithuania's NATO membership, creating a wider global conflict. All over Kaliningrad. It's also worth expanding on this concept of Kaliningrad becoming the fourth Baltic state. That's essentially what would happen if it were to gain independence from Russia, and some countries are already treating the region as an independent territory, at least in name. Countries like Poland. In May 2023, Poland decided that it would no longer refer to Kaliningrad by that name in any of its official documentation. Instead, it'll call the region Królewicz, the name it had when it was ruled by the Kingdom of Poland during the 15th and 16th centuries. That decision adds a further wrinkle to the tale. Some could argue that this appears to be a direct act of aggression by Poland, with the name change suggesting that it might have designs on claiming Kaliningrad as its own. That isn't the case, at least according to the country's development minister Waldemar Buda, who says the decision was made to prevent Russification in Poland. We do not want Russification in Poland, and that's why we have decided to change the name in our native language of Kaliningrad and the Kaliningrad region, he said when explaining Poland's decision. Either way, Russia is furious. The Kremlin described the decision as a hostile act, likely because it clearly serves as an indirect question of Russia's control over Kaliningrad. Again, we see fuel being poured onto the fire of the oblast's independence movement. After all, if one country is willing to recognize Kaliningrad as a separate entity, even in name only, there's a chance that others could follow suit. That's the last thing that Putin wants. So we have several reasons why Kaliningrad could become Ukraine 2.0 in the coming years. The growing independence movement in the oblast represents a clear threat to Moscow that Putin will want to put down. Lithuania and its decision to restrict Russian travel through its territory isolate Moscow further from Kaliningrad, perhaps feeding into the region's independence movement while angering Putin. Then there's Poland's naming decision, a hostile act that only feeds into the idea of Kaliningrad becoming an independent region. Now let's switch focus to another issue, the Baltic Fleet. We've already touched on one of the reasons why Kaliningrad is such an important territory for Russia. The oblast's port city, Baltiysk, is the only port Russia has on the Baltic Sea that doesn't ice over when the winter comes. It's where Russia stations its Baltic fleet. In 2008, the most recent year for which we have figures, that fleet numbered 55 combat ships of varying types. These included several destroyers, corvettes, and frigates, along with landing ships and a pair of submarines. The fleet roughly represents about a tenth of Russia's entire naval power, and it needs constant support in terms of resources and personnel to be effective. Enter Lithuania's decision to ban Russians from traveling through its territory again. Not only does that decision hinder Russia from delivering supplies to the people, but it also has an impact on the Baltic fleet stationed in the oblast. Again, we point to St. Petersburg and the fact that its ports ice over in the winter. When that happens, the Baltic fleet is essentially cut off from Moscow, ending up stuck in the only warm water port that Russia has in the Baltic Sea. Worse yet for Russia, being cut off from Kaliningrad reduces its ability to keep control over the Baltic Sea. That's especially the case now that Finland, another old rival of Russia's, has become a NATO member. With that membership granted, NATO has extended its own border along the Baltic Sea, leading some to start calling the small stretch of water a NATO lake. A lake that NATO could use to even further isolate Kaliningrad from Russia. What does that have to do with Ukraine? Russia found itself in a similar situation with Ukraine several years before it invaded the country. As Kaliningrad is host to the Baltic Fleet, so too was Sevastopol home to the Black Sea Fleet further south. Sevastopol is in the Crimean region, which created a problem for Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed. Crimea went to Ukraine, with Kyiv then potentially having a claim over the former Soviet Union's Black Sea Fleet. Russia wasn't about to hand over a large chunk of its navy to a country that was now independent of it, resulting in a compromise being reached in 1997, the Partition Treaty on the Status and Conditions of the Black Sea Fleet. Under that treaty, 9 out of every 11 ships in the Black Sea Fleet were given back to Russia, with the remaining 2 staying with Ukraine. While that may seem to be a bad deal for Ukraine, because it was, the country was strapped for cash at the time of the treaty's signing. So in return for the lopsided deal, Russia promised to pay Ukraine $526 million. However, there was something that Russia wanted even more than the ships: the Sevastopol base in which the Black Sea Fleet was docked. Russia couldn't buy that base outright, it was part of Ukraine, but it could rent the base from Ukraine, giving it access to another crucial warm water port while also ensuring its Black Sea Fleet actually had access to the sea that gave it the name. Russia inked another deal with Ukraine, this time promising to pay $97 million per year to rent the base, while at the same time promising to respect the sovereignty and independence of the new Ukrainian state. We all know how that worked out. But why did we get to this point where Russia invaded Ukraine? The simple answer is that Russia had a problem. Its Sevastopol base lease wasn't permanent. Toward the end of 2008, Putin found himself dealing with Viktor Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko, Ukraine's president and prime minister respectively, and crucially, both pro-West politicians. They announced that when 2017 arrived, Russia would have to leave Sevastopol, handing the base back to Ukraine. But there was another twist in the tale. In 2010, Yushchenko was ousted by Viktor Yanukovych, meaning the Ukrainian presidency was anti-West again. Wasting no time, Yanukovych extended Russia's lease at Sevastopol until 2042, once again securing Russia's access to the Black Sea. All was well for Russia again, until the 2014 Maidan Revolution saw Yanukovych flee Ukraine, placing the lease in danger once more. This time, Putin wasn't going to sit back and take the potential loss of a valuable base. Instead, taking advantage of the chaos the revolution caused, he chose to annex Crimea, claiming Sevastopol as Russian territory in the process and getting rid of the whole leasing issue. It's here where the parallels with Kaliningrad become clearer. When Russia annexed Crimea, Ukraine retaliated by blocking Russian land access to the Crimean Peninsula, thus preventing the country from transporting anything to its Black Sea Fleet by land. It's almost a mirror image of what Lithuania has done to Russia in relation to the Baltic Fleet. At first, Russia navigated around this restriction by ferrying troops and equipment into Sevastopol via the Kerch Strait. But that approach had limitations, resulting in Russia taking a second option: construction of the Crimea Bridge. Opened in 2018, the bridge allows cars, trucks, and, in 2020, freight rail passengers to access Sevastopol without having to worry about Ukraine's land restrictions. Interestingly, we see the importance of that bridge in Russia's movements throughout Ukraine since the war began. It's pushed south heavily toward Mariupol because it needs that land to complete the Crimea Bridge. The importance of this bridge is also the reason why Ukraine has targeted it numerous times. It's already launched 2 attacks against the bridge, with an April 2024 report published in The Guardian suggesting that a third attack is inevitable. Taking out that bridge would force Russia to transport its war supplies through southern Ukraine, perhaps hindering Moscow's forces on the ground by slowing down their access to supplies. But let's bring things back to the situation in Kaliningrad. Right now, Russia faces a similar problem to the one it dealt with when it took Crimea. It owns the land, but it doesn't have access to it. And in the case of Kaliningrad, it can't get around the lack of access by building a new bridge. It needs to go through Lithuania, a country that's imposed heavy sanctions on Russia due to the war in Ukraine. And perhaps Putin might decide that the only way to regain full access to Kaliningrad will be to take Lithuania, getting rid of the sanctions issue in the process. And make no mistake, Russia wants to keep control of Kaliningrad. Not only is it the site of the Baltic fleet, but it's also home to several of Russia's Iskander missiles. Those missiles are capable of carrying nuclear payloads. Given Kaliningrad's positioning, remember that it's the furthest Russian territory that reaches into Europe, Putin will want to maintain access simply so he can use Kaliningrad to make nuclear threats should he need to. Still, there's one saving grace that might prevent Putin from launching any attacks against Lithuania that would restore its access to Kaliningrad, akin to the annexation of Crimea. Lithuania is a member of NATO. That membership means that Lithuania benefits from Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which says that any attack on a NATO member's land is considered an attack on all NATO members. It's the Three Musketeers principle, all for one and one for all, expanded to a global scale. If Putin were to attack Lithuania, it wouldn't just be Lithuania that he would have to fight. He would drag the United Kingdom into the war, France, Germany, Latvia, and Estonia, Lithuania's Baltic neighbors, and most importantly, the United States. None of those countries have directly intervened in the war in Ukraine because Ukraine isn't a NATO member. They've been limited to sending money and supplies, but if Russia launched an attack on Lithuania, they're duty-bound to respond militaristically, which could ignite a Third World War. So the Kaliningrad situation rests on a knife edge. It's still Russian territory, with the fact being unlikely to change, even though the independence movement within the exclave is growing stronger by the month. It also offers disturbing parallels to Ukraine, particularly in the sense of how Kaliningrad mirrors the issues Russia had with the Sevastopol base in terms of land access. Moscow is even having to deal with some countries, Poland key among them, starting to treat Kaliningrad somewhat like an independent state. But there are key factors that might stay Putin's hand. NATO is the obvious one. Russia likely doesn't have the appetite for a global war that would draw in its strongest enemy, making it unlikely that he would attempt to take Lithuania to restore ground access to Kaliningrad. Then there's the uncertainty over the Ukraine war and what its aftermath might look like to consider. If Russia wins, would it then be able to rebuild its relationship with the Baltic states to the point where free travel to Kaliningrad is in its reach once more? Only time will tell. For now, we'll turn things over to you. How important a role do you believe Kaliningrad will play in global geopolitics in the years to come? Do you think that Putin would risk starting another world war, turning Kaliningrad into Ukraine 2.0, just to restore land-based access to his Baltic fleet? On April 13, 2024, Iran launched a barrage of attacks against Israel, sending over 300 drones and cruise and ballistic missiles its way. Yet not a single drone or cruise missile managed to enter Israeli airspace. For the most part, Israel has its multi-layered air defense system to thank for this extraordinary success rate. Still, the country wouldn't have been able to pull off this remarkable achievement without a hastily assembled coalition, including the US and the UK, which helped shoot down Iranian drones over Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. The speed and effectiveness at which allies came together to protect Israel brought one question to the forefront: why can't the same level of coordination and support be extended to Ukraine? Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was the first to pose the question, shortly followed by the German parliament, the famous Bundestag. In a rare feat, both the leading and opposing parties in the Bundestag were in favor of deploying the NATO integrated air defense system to protect Ukrainian airspace. But how would this protection work? Would Germany be the only country to commit resources? And why does Ukraine need so much help in the first place? These are just some of the questions we'll answer as this video progresses. But first, let's see how this important idea started brewing in Germany. The German parliament members, MPs, were actually the first to put this idea forward. It initially came from German military experts like Nico Lange, a senior fellow at the Munich Security Conference, and Lieutenant General Heinrich Braus, a former NATO Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning. However, it's the Bundestag that has the power to turn this idea into reality, so it shouldn't be surprising that the proposal only gained significant traction when taken up by German parliament members. As mentioned, and as reported by Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, a German media outlet, both the members of the ruling liberal-left coalition, the Greens and the Free Democratic Party, as well as the members of the opposing Christian Democratic Union, supported the idea of deploying NATO air defense systems to protect Ukrainian airspace. Here's what MPs from these parties had to say on the matter. Markus Faber of the Free Democratic Party discussed the feasibility of Ukrainian protection plans in the long run. He pointed out that there's currently a limited number of air defense systems and missiles available. So according to Faber, step one would be securing a sufficient number of these systems. Only then should the Western allies fully commit to protecting the Ukrainian skies. Roderick Kiesewetter of the Christian Democratic Union explained what kind of effect this commitment would have on Ukraine. According to him, shooting down Russian drones over Ukraine would ease the burden on the Ukrainian air defense and allow it to protect the front. And given how forcefully Russia has been attacking that front in recent times, Ukraine can't afford to miss any opportunity to strengthen its defenses. But how would this strengthening even work? Agnieszka Brugger, the deputy chair of the Greens, explained which part of the Ukrainian airspace could be protected by NATO, as well as which countries should be part of this endeavor. In her words, the air defense systems should be deployed on the borders of countries that border Ukraine, so that they could also protect Ukraine's western regions. Anton Hofreiter, the chairman of the German Committee on European Affairs and a member of the same party, further specified which countries could be expected to help protect Ukraine in the long run. According to Hofreiter, Ukrainian airspace could be protected by systems located on the territory of Poland and Romania. The plan is to establish a safe zone extending some 43 miles into the Ukrainian territory and protect this zone using the NATO Integrated Air Defense System units stationed in these two countries. The NATO Integrated Air and Missile Defense System, NATINAMS for short, is a command and control network that combines the radar, missile systems, and aircraft of NATO member countries to ensure comprehensive air defense coverage and coordination. The Center Allied Air Command of all NATO member countries in Europe is based at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, which coordinates centers spread all over the continent. Both Romania and Poland house an air operations center, the former in Baltic and the latter in Poland, Warsaw Pry. Both countries also have a rather developed complex of radar stations, which makes them ideal candidates for helping to protect Ukrainian airspace. As far as their equipment goes, the Polish Air Force boasts the Backbone system, comprised of 3 NUR-12M and 3 RAT-31DL long-range radars, while the Romanian Air Force possesses 5 ANFPS-117 air search radars distributed across 5 radar stations. But as you probably know, radars alone aren't enough to ensure effective air defense. That's why additional air defense systems would have to be set up on the territory of these two countries. For now, we can only speculate on what these systems might be based on the model used for this proposal, the Iranian attack on Israel. With this in mind, let's look at how this attack unfolded and, more importantly, how it was thwarted. Sometime after midnight on April 13th, the Israeli air raid alerts blasted through the night. Citizens were urged to seek shelter as explosions erupted in the distance. The reason for these alerts lay in the 170 drones, 110 ballistic missiles, and 30 cruise missiles launched by Iran, targeting strategic locations throughout Israel. However, the explosions echoing through the air weren't the sounds of these missiles and drones hitting their target. No, they were the sounds of successful interceptions. Only a handful of the 110 ballistic missiles managed to reach the country, while none of the 170 drones and 30 cruise missiles had the chance. This was made possible by the swift reaction of several countries. The projectiles were fired from Iran's territory, as well as Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. They were intercepted and downed by Israel, the US, the UK, and Jordan. Let's start with Israel. As part of the first line of defense, the country sent the F-35 combat fighters to intercept the projectiles. This was possible due to the fact that most of the projectiles were sent from relatively far away. The shortest distance from Iran to Israel is about 620 miles and includes the airspaces of Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. With this swift action, Israel was able to take out 25 of the 30 cruise missiles outside the country. For any projectile that managed to slip through the first line of defense, Israel used the Aerial Defense Array, a newly installed national air defense system. The system in question has been in place since Hamas attacked Israel on October 7, 2023, and it consists of 3 layers. Layer number 1, the Arrow missile defense. The highest tier of the aerial defense array was used to physically intercept long-range ballistic missiles, and it did so successfully, primarily relying on the Arrow 3 exo-atmospheric hypersonic anti-ballistic missiles. Layer number 2, the David's Sling. The middle tier of the aerial defense array was employed to take out short-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, downing them as far as 186 miles away from Israel. Layer number 3, the Iron Dome system. This system is the reason why none of the 170 drones fired by Iran reached Israeli airspace, let alone any of their targets. Though this system was initially designed to protect cities and strategic sites against unguided rockets, it's recently been upgraded to take out drones as well, a decision that has obviously saved the day in Israel. So that's how Israel alone defended its territory against the incoming threat, but what about the allies? According to US President Joe Biden, the US forces helped Israel take down nearly all drones and missiles launched on that fateful Friday. The US Central Command, CENTCOM, went into more detail. According to CENTCOM, its forces took out over 80 drones and at least 6 ballistic missiles, some of which, 1 missile and 7 drones, were destroyed before they were even launched from the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. Others were downed over southern Syria, with air defense systems deployed from undisclosed bases in the region. 2 aircraft and 2 destroyers that the US moved to the region before the Iranian attacks also helped, shooting down 4 to 6 ballistic missiles. But as helpful as these counterattacks were, they weren't the most significant contribution to the Israeli defensive operation. The US intelligence was. The intricate command and control system set up between the US, Israel, and some Arab neighboring countries provided extremely precise intelligence that essentially helped Israel neutralize all the threats coming its way. So the US did its fair share in defending Israel. What about the UK? The UK also rose to the occasion, sending Royal Air Force Typhoon combat jets to shoot down a number of Iranian drones. As for Jordan, you might be surprised to see this country among the nations helping down threats coming for Israel, given how critical Jordan was of the Israeli actions against Hamas in Gaza. However, Jordan didn't do it for the sake of protecting Israel, despite having a peace treaty with the country. It did it to protect its citizens, as a number of Iranian missiles and drones entered Jordanian airspace. Remember, Jordan was a part of the shortest route from Iran to Israel. For this endeavor, Jordan relied on its advanced radar systems, air-to-air missiles, and F-16 supersonic fighter jets, which proved extremely useful, even at night. France was also involved in the conflict, but there's no official information on whether the country downed any drones or missiles. For now, all that's known is that it helped patrol Israeli airspace. Given how comprehensive the response to the Iranian attacks was, it shouldn't be surprising that only 5 ballistic missiles managed to evade air defenses and impact Israeli territory. 4 of them landed in the Air Force base housing the Israeli F-35 fighter jets, the very same jets used to defend Israel against Iran. The only missile that did any damage hit a runway. The others hit hangars which were either empty or out of use. The 5th ballistic missile did manage to reach Israel, but it didn't reach its intended target, a radar site in the north of the country. So there you have it, a masterclass on how a well-coordinated and multi-layered air defense system, supported by international collaboration and advanced technology, can effectively neutralize a significant missile and drone threat. So what's the issue? Why can't the same be done in Ukraine? Well, for starters, Ukraine's air defense system doesn't even come close to the sophistication and integration of Israel's air defense network. This rang true even before the Russian invasion, but the conflict has further exacerbated the challenges. As Zelensky put it, Ukraine lacks the sufficient air defense equipment to protect the country against the Russian terror. However, he also declared that another, more important element was missing for this defense: the world's determination to protect Ukraine and stand up against Russia in the skies. That's the reason Zelensky asked for allied help to protect the Ukrainian airspace in the first place. As he pointed out, neither Israel nor Ukraine are NATO member countries. So if NATO allies can help protect Israel against missiles and drones, what stops them from doing the same for Ukraine? Unfortunately, the answer is rather simple: a fear of drawing NATO into a war against Russia. Though the Israeli scenario demonstrated that NATO allies can interfere without joining the conflict, it seems that the situation in Ukraine is viewed through a different geopolitical lens. That's why the US and the UK outright refuse to commit any resources to guarding the Ukrainian airspace. As John Kirby, the White House National Security Council Strategic Communications Coordinator, explained the US's refusal to help Ukraine in 7 words: different conflicts, different airspace, different threat patterns. Though he did add that President Biden always made it clear that the US had no plans to directly engage in the conflict in Ukraine. The country is, however, Ukraine's #1 military aid provider by a margin, which means the US provides Ukraine with the necessary weapons to protect its airspace, and this is no small feat. As for the UK, the country's Foreign Secretary David Cameron was a bit more direct when addressing the UK's refusal to help Ukraine shoot down Russian drones. In an interview with LBC, a UK radio station, he outright said that the reason for the refusal lies in the fear of escalating the conflict into a direct confrontation with Russia. His exact words were, "If you want to avoid an escalation in terms of a wider European war, I think the one thing you need to do is avoid NATO troops directly engaging Russian troops. That will be a danger of escalation." Cameron added that using fighter jets to down drones, as the UK did in Israel, isn't always the best option. Air defense systems are more effective. In other words, Ukraine needs air defense systems and not fighter jets. The UK lacks the former, or at least the systems that would make the biggest change, the Patriot surface-to-air missile system. However, a lack of sufficient air defense systems isn't the only reason why Ukraine is desperately asking Germany and other NATO allies for help. The problem also lies in the proliferation of Russian drones. Russia was somewhat slow to adapt drone technology, but it's now making up for it by growing its fleet at an unprecedented rate. This particularly applies to the so-called kamikaze drones, a kind of aerial weapon designed to loiter around a target until it's located and then attack it by crashing into it. Russia is going all out on these drones. At first, Russia imported them from Iran, opting for the country's Haysa Shahed 136 models. In 2 years, Russia has imported thousands of these drones and fired over 4,600 of them. With a reported weight of about 440 pounds, they fly as fast as 115 miles per hour and have a flying range between 620 and 1,550 miles. Though the Shahed 136 drones were believed to be extremely cheap for unmanned aerial vehicle technology, a leaked correspondence suggests that Russia has been paying between 193,000 and 290,000 per drone. The former figure applies to batches of 6,000 drones, while the latter is for batches of 2,000 drones bought. That's likely why Russia has set up domestic production facilities that allow it to be substantially less dependent on Iranian drones. According to reports, Russia plans to produce 6,000 of these drones domestically by the summer of 2025. And the more drones that are produced, the more will be launched against Ukrainian targets, depleting the country's anti-drone ammunition. To make matters worse, Russia has also been experimenting with modifying the Shahed 136 to make them even more destructive. Some of these experiments include spraying drones to reduce detection and adding cameras to enhance reconnaissance capabilities. Though these modifications are yet to make any change in the Russian war effort, they serve as a concerning reminder that Russia will stop at nothing to advance its military capabilities and crush Ukrainian resistance. These incessant efforts also include working with Iran on developing new attack drones specifically for the war in Ukraine. The drones, cited as a huge concern for Ukraine, are described as explosive and reconnaissance drones that could potentially seek out high-value targets, including the US and UK multiple-launch rocket systems used on the Ukrainian battlefields. The Shahed 107 drones, as they are called, are roughly 8 feet long, can be launched from a vehicle, and have a flying range of up to 930 miles. Another testament to the Russian "the end justifies the means" mentality is the fact that the country has children producing its drones. Yep, you heard that correctly. Activists from the cyber resistance group published a series of documents that prove that the previously mentioned Shahed 136 combat drones are manufactured by underage civilians enrolled in the Alabuga Polytech College in the Alabuga Special Economic Zone. In 2024 alone, these unexpected manufacturers are expected to produce 10,000 drone units. To reach this staggering number, over 500 students have been allocated to the drone production project. That's roughly 40% of the total number of students enrolled in 2023, which was 1,209. These students are engaged in various fields of manufacturing, including electric installation, industrial robotics, and numerical control programming. Given Russia's unscrupulous but unyielding efforts in the drone department, it shouldn't be surprising Ukraine needs all the help it can get in the skies. Though to be fair, Ukraine boasts pretty impressive interception rates, given the threat it faces every day. But when it comes to suicide drones, only a 100% interception rate would be considered satisfactory. Why? Because even if a single drone reaches its target, it can unleash devastation and take many lives in the process. Worst of all, the Ukrainian success rate at intercepting drones is gradually decreasing. The first few months of 2024 have been particularly challenging, as Ukraine has stretched its air defense units to their limits, facing an onslaught of Russian drones hitting cities with deadly accuracy and frequency, and Ukraine has only managed to shoot down about 82% of them. This begs the question, how low will this rate go before the Western allies interfere? As things stand, Ukraine can only defend itself against these deadly attacks with their help. The help in question could come in two forms. Number one, the Allies can supply more air defense systems to Ukraine, prioritizing models designed to intercept drones. Number two, the Allies could get involved more directly. They can support Ukrainian efforts to strike crucial targets like air bases, manufacturing facilities, and drone storage sites within Russia. After all, destroying Russian drones before they're even launched is the most effective way to protect Ukraine from the devastation they cause. The second approach also includes downing the already launched drones, which is what NATO essentially did for Israel. So will Ukraine be as lucky as Israel anytime soon? As things currently stand, the answer is unfortunately no, well, at least as far as the second, more direct approach goes. You see, the German proposal to use NATO-integrated air defense systems to protect Ukrainian airspace has been rejected by the ruling party, the Social Democratic Party. Why? For the same reasons the US and UK refuse to help Ukraine. It's simply too dangerous. To quote the head of the Social Democratic Party, Rolf Mützenich, protecting Ukrainian airspace via a NATO deployment would go against the principle of not becoming actively engaged in the war. Mützenich used two simple words to describe what this proposal could be: fire hazard. And the fire in question could consume not just Ukraine, but NATO as well. However, it's highly unlikely German MPs will just give up on the idea. After all, we're talking about a country that has helped Ukraine massively since the beginning of Russian aggression, so much so that it's become the second largest provider of military aid to the country. A great deal of this aid has also been focused on the Ukrainian Air Force specifically. Here's a brief overview of all the air defense systems Germany sent to Ukraine since the beginning of the invasion. 9 TRML-4D air surveillance radars, 2 Skynex air defense systems with ammunition, 52 Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns with spare parts, 146,000 rounds of ammunition for the Gepard guns, 4,000 rounds of practice ammunition for self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, 500 Stinger man-portable air defense systems, 2,700 Strela man-portable air defense systems, 3 Iris-T SLM and 1 Iris-T SLS air defense system with missiles, and 2 Patriot air defense systems with missiles and spare parts. And that's not all. As of May 2024, Germany plans to further raise these numbers by sending another Patriot air defense system and more Patriot missiles, 2 more Skynex air defense systems with ammunition, 9 more Iris-T SLM systems, 11 more Iris-T SLS systems, and additional Iris-T SLM and Iris-T SLS missiles, and 15 Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns with 249,680 rounds of ammunition. In the drone department, Germany has been equally generous. So far, the country has sent the following equipment: 212 vector reconnaissance drones with spare parts, 215 RQ-35 Hydron reconnaissance drones, 18 Promoco-1 reconnaissance drones, 7 Songbird reconnaissance drones, 70 frequency range extensions for anti-drone devices, 84 anti-drone sensors and jammers, 180 RF-360 drone detection systems, 93 drone sensors, 1 Lunar NG reconnaissance system, 10 anti-drone guns, 12 electronic anti-drone devices, and 20 unmanned surface vessels. Plus, in the coming months, Germany will send an additional 263 vector drones, 34 Hydron drones, 15 anti-drone sensors and jammers, and 50 unmanned surface vessels. Though each of these pieces of equipment is a lifesaver for Ukraine in its fight to protect its skies, none are arguably as important as the Iris and Patriot air defense systems. The Iris systems gifted by Germany have so far demonstrated a 100% kill rate in the Ukrainian war, managing to shoot down all targets, even when facing overwhelming odds. This system has also proven incredibly successful against the notorious Shahed 136 kamikaze drones. One look at the capabilities of the Iris air defense systems, and these success rates will make perfect sense. The Iris missile itself has a range of up to 25 miles and can hit targets flying at an altitude of up to 66,000 feet. The system's radar has a detection range of up to 155 miles, which allows it to track targets with high precision. But the best thing about this system is the agility of the Iris missile. This, paired with an active radar proximity fuse and improved heat-seeking homing, allows the missile to take out fast-moving and small targets like those often seen in Russian attacks on Ukraine. As far as the Patriot air defense system goes, it offers a higher altitude defense against ballistic missiles, aircraft, and drones, sort of like the highest tier of the Israeli aerial defense array. As Ukraine lacks native air defenses, it heavily relies on the Patriot system to safeguard its airspace. According to Zelensky, Ukraine needs about 25 of these systems to successfully do so. However, so far Germany has been the only country that has sent multiple Patriot systems and batteries to Ukraine. Despite Zelensky's pleading with allies to follow in Germany's footsteps, none of the other NATO countries that possess these systems, Greece, the Netherlands, Poland, Romania, Spain, and Sweden, have committed to sending them. As for the US, the country sent 1 Patriot system in 2022. However, it plans to send more in 2024 as part of a massive aid package. But what makes Germany different from all other allies is, the country hasn't just been sending military aid to Ukraine, it's also been tirelessly pleading with other allies to do so. That's why this current push to use the NATO integrated air defense system to protect Ukraine seems so promising. As mentioned, Germany has been particularly proactive about Ukrainian air defense. In April 2024, the country launched a new initiative to secure more critically needed air defense systems for Ukraine. As Germany's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock, puts it, stronger air defenses are a matter of life and death for thousands of people in Ukraine and the best protection for our own security. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz continued these pleas by urging European allies to look at their stocks and provide whatever air defense systems they can to Ukraine. Of course, he highlighted the importance of the Patriot systems, which are the only systems that can counter all Russian attacks, whether via aircraft, missiles, or drones. Now, European countries are facing a choice: meet NATO's capability targets for their own states or provide more aid to Ukraine. However, even NATO seems to be pushing for the second option, joining Germany's efforts. The alliance's Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, said that sacrificing individual countries' stockpile targets for the sake of aiding Ukraine is the only right choice. For now, it seems that the Netherlands, Czech Republic, and Denmark might be the first to rally behind the proposal. Polish officials have also previously discussed the possibility of aiding Ukraine more directly, but so far no concrete decisions have been made. Though if Germany succeeds in realizing its proposal, Poland will undoubtedly have a major role to play in defending Ukrainian airspace. But what do you think? Do you believe Germany will manage to find a way to protect Ukrainian airspace from drones? And if so, will Russia see this move as a clear message that Ukraine isn't alone, or just as an invitation to start an all-out war? And finally, which countries besides Germany will risk this all-out war to help Ukraine?
It's January 2024, and General Patrick Sanders stands before an audience at the International Armored Vehicles Exhibition in London. However, the general doesn't merely have vehicles on his mind. A much bigger problem troubles him: Russia. During his speech, Sanders stresses that the UK needs to achieve a mental shift, particularly when it comes to the British public and its collective preparedness for war. Conscription still isn't on the table, the general says, but the country's army as it stands right now isn't strong enough. He tells the audience that the UK needs to modernize and may even have to build a citizen army that's ready for a land war. He then delivers a chilling warning. Within the next 3 years, it must be credible to talk of a British army of 120,000 folding in our reserve and strategic force, but this is not enough. Why will it not be enough? Again, Russia. Sanders' speech rattles a few cages at 10 Downing Street. Former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak dismisses Sanders' words, saying that presenting hypothetical scenarios isn't helpful to anybody. That especially goes for the general's comments that the Ukraine war has shown that it's not regular armies that win wars, it's citizen armies. The UK should follow in Ukraine's footsteps, he argues, or at the very least, be mentally prepared to do so. His message is clear: the UK has no choice but to prepare for war with Russia. And his statements lead to some questions. Why does the UK have to prepare, and just how credible are Sanders' claims? Assuming the general is correct, how would the UK fare if it faced Russia today? And what, if anything, is it doing to prepare for a war with one of the world's largest militaries? To begin answering those questions, we must first dive into the relationship between the UK and Russia. Both nations have essentially been at peace since the end of the Crimean War and have been allies fighting alongside each other in 2 world wars. Given that somewhat friendly history, how have relations between the two countries fractured to the point where the UK needs to be ready for war? It all starts with the rise of Vladimir Putin. Putin's rise to the Russian presidency in 2000 marked the end of the cooperative relationship the UK enjoyed with Russia following the end of the Cold War. That end didn't come immediately. Rather, a series of events slowly transformed the relationship from one of cooperation into one of confrontation, perhaps starting with an infamous incident, the 2006 murder of Alexander Litvinenko. A former officer with the Federal Security Service, or FSB, Russia's replacement for the KGB, Litvinenko was a Russian spy who had become critical of his country. In 1999, Litvinenko earned the FSB's ire when he claimed that the agency had begun colluding with the Russian mafia and was responsible for several apartment bombings in Russian cities that Russia then used to justify the Chechen War. But perhaps more dangerous to Litvinenko, according to a 2016 report by The Guardian, was that he had a personal vendetta against Putin. When Putin became the director of FSB in 1998, 2 years before he ascended to the presidency, Litvinenko met with him to argue against the corruption he saw in the agency. Putin listened to him make his case and did nothing, creating bad blood between the two. It's likely this incident that prompted Litvinenko to leave FSB and flee to Britain in 2000, where it's believed he started working for the MI6 spy agency and developed associations with former Chechen leader Akhmed Zakayev and a Russian oligarch named Boris Berezovsky, both critics of the Kremlin, both enemies of Vladimir Putin. If those associations weren't bad enough, Litvinenko was also not shy about attacking Russia's president. In July 2006, he wrote an explosive article in which he claimed Putin was a pedophile who had abused his position as the head of FSB in the late 1990s to destroy videotape evidence of himself having sex with underage boys. Add to that further accusations that Putin was responsible for the October 2006 murder of a Russian journalist named Anna Politkovskaya, and Litvinenko had placed himself on Putin's hit list. It wouldn't be long before Putin enacted his revenge. In November 2006, Litvinenko was killed inside the UK through the use of a poison named polonium-210, which had been administered to a cup of tea. The inquest that followed revealed that Litvinenko was being paid by MI6, though the specific terms of his employment weren't revealed, and that he had been targeted by assassins. Specifically, the two men he met for that fateful cup of tea, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, were accused of being the men who administered the poison. However, they weren't acting alone. The inquest revealed that Putin likely greenlit the order to kill Litvinenko. The assassination triggered a turning point in UK and Russian relations, with the UK being incensed over the fact that Russia would kill somebody on British soil. In addition, Russia had been uncooperative with the investigation and even refused to extradite one of the suspects. Several Russian diplomats were expelled from the country in response to the killing, along with the UK ending its intelligence cooperation with Russia and freezing some of its assets. If nothing else, the incident showed the UK that Putin was willing to violate the country's laws to get what he wanted. Litvinenko's assassination wouldn't be the last time this happened. In March 2018, a Russian double agent named Sergei Skripal was poisoned in the UK. A former officer with Russia's GRU agency, a military intelligence unit, Skripal and his daughter were found slumped on a park bench 8 years after arriving in the UK as part of a spy swap deal in 2010. Both survived. Two Russian men, Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Borisov, were accused of the crime, and details soon emerged that demonstrated the covert nature of their attempted assassination. Skripal was poisoned using a Russian-made military-grade nerve agent, with the poison having been applied through the squirt of a perfume bottle. Russia denied all involvement. It claimed that rogue elements had somehow gained access to the nerve agent and had used it without the Kremlin's knowledge. Britain's then Prime Minister Theresa May gave Putin 24 hours to prove his claims, which he failed to do so in the eyes of the British government. By March 2018, the UK was saying that there was no alternative conclusion other than the Russian state was culpable for the attempted murder of Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Another attack on citizens inside the UK, and yet another incident that further soured the relationship between Britain and Russia. The Guardian claimed in 2018 that the incident plunged the relationship between the countries to its lowest depths since the 1980s and the cruise missile crisis. But those relations would reach new depths in February 2022. On February 17, 2022, the UK created new legislation that would give its ministers the power to impose fresh sanctions on Russia's businesses and oligarchs. The decision came in the wake of growing tensions in Europe as Putin appeared to be gearing up to invade Ukraine. About a week later, Russian soldiers started a war that continues to rage to this day. The UK joined the rest of the Western international community in condemning the war and used its new powers to levy sanctions. It also began supplying aid to Ukraine, along with many other countries, with Britain's contributions having reached $54.2 billion in value as of July 2024. All of this backstory matters because it paints a picture of the two countries that have experienced continued fracturing of their relationship over the last 24 years. Through his assassination attempts, Putin has shown that he not only lacks respect for the UK and its laws, but that he's willing to deploy agents into the country to get what he wants. He has set a precedent. Russia has operated in Britain before, and it may well do so again. Only this time those operations would escalate into full-scale war. Assassinations, secret plots, and sanctions combined do not create an atmosphere in which that war would occur. It's what's happened since Russia invaded Ukraine that has led the UK to the point where it needs to prepare. Take the repeated threats from Russia as an example. In February 2024, Russia's former president Dmitry Medvedev commented on the concept of Russia returning to the borders it had in 1991. Doing so would be untenable, claimed Medvedev, who now serves as Russia's Security Council head, as it would mean Russia would have to give up the territory it's taken in Ukraine, as well as Crimea and Chechnya. Speaking on Telegram, a social media platform that's popular in Russia, Medvedev issued a chilling threat. Attempts to return Russia to the borders of 1991 will lead to only one thing:
towards a global war with Western countries using the entire strategic arsenal of our state. Medvedev then claimed that any attempt to return to those borders would represent the West forcing a direct and irreversible collapse of Russia, before he built on his strategic arsenal comments. Threats were levied against Kyiv, Washington, Berlin, and London, with Medvedev claiming all four have long been included in the flight targets of our nuclear triad. Better to return everything to how Russia wants it, demanded Medvedev, or Russia will return it themselves, with maximum losses for the enemy. The context here is simple. Russia would be prepared to use nuclear weapons to strike Britain if the UK takes part in any concerted effort to force Russia to return to its old borders. Suddenly, General Sanders' comments about the need to be prepared are cast in a new light. Perhaps they're not a case of scaremongering, but instead the statements of a man who has seen enough to know that Russia is a clear threat. Sanders sees the deterioration of the relationship between Russia and Britain, with Medvedev's nuclear threats only confirming that he's likely right to be worried. Speaking of those nuclear threats, just what would Britain face if Russia pushed the nuclear button? In 2023, the Arms Control Association, or ACA, estimated that Russia has a stockpile of 5,580 nuclear weapons. About 1,200 of these have been retired, meaning they're no longer in active stockpile and are awaiting dismantling. Of course, given that they aren't dismantled yet, those nukes could still be used if Russia felt the need. However, more worrying for Britain are the 1,549 strategically deployed nuclear warheads. These are warheads that are currently installed on ballistic missiles and ready to launch at a moment's notice. It's unknown how many of that 1,549 are directed at Britain. However, we do know that Russia easily has enough nuclear weapons to level the United Kingdom. In October 2022, the UK-based Sky News ran a report in which it examined the threat that Russia's nuclear weapons pose. General Sir Richard Barrons, a British defense expert, is quoted when commenting on Putin's decision to place his nuclear deterrent forces on high alert in March 2022. Speaking about Russia's weapons, he claimed, "The warhead at the front of it has a yield between 300 and 800 kilotons. It would take just one of these nuclear weapons to destroy London," Barrons says. The UK isn't helpless on the nuclear front. The ACA highlights that it has 224 nukes of its own, plus it's allied with France and the United States, which are both NATO members and nuclear states that would come to Britain's defense if it was attacked on its own soil. But by that point, it would be too late for Britain. Russia has more than enough nuclear weapons to destroy all of the UK's major cities. Of course, these are far from the only nuclear threats that Russia has thrown around. It has a long history of using the threat of nukes to try and get its way, dating back to the Cold War era. Yet another nuclear threat, albeit one made in response to the possibility of Russia losing its current borders, may not be enough to convince Britain that it needs to prepare for war. But Medvedev's is far from the only threat made by Russia to the UK. During a state visit to Ukraine in May 2024, former British Foreign Secretary David Cameron committed to delivering at least $3 billion in military aid annually to Ukraine for as long as is required. However, that wasn't the headline from the visit. Instead, it was a single quote that made waves. "Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself." The quote was taken as Cameron's indirect way of permitting Ukraine to do something it had previously been unable to do, use British-provided weapons to attack Russia on its own soil. While Cameron's comments provided room for doubt, further comments made by new British Prime Minister Keir Starmer removed that doubt entirely. Speaking to Bloomberg journalists on July 9, 2024, Starmer claimed that it was up to Ukraine to decide how it would use British weapons, including the long-range Storm Shadow missiles the UK has been sending. Those missiles can travel for 155 miles, far enough for Ukraine to launch them from within its own territory to strike at Russia behind the front lines of the war. Russia was incensed. In the wake of Cameron's comments, Moscow summoned Britain's ambassador to Russia to the Foreign Ministry to deliver a message. Any strikes made by Ukraine on Russian territory using weapons supplied by the UK would force retaliatory strikes on British military facilities, both in Ukraine and elsewhere. The implication is that elsewhere could mean on British soil. Yet another threat. And yet another justification for General Sanders' comments that Britain needs to prepare. The UK didn't backpedal on Cameron's statements in the wake of Russia's threats, with Starmer's July 2024 comments only adding fuel to the fire. Russia argues that Britain is needlessly escalating tensions. The UK's refusal to back down means that the threat of war between the two countries is higher than ever. However, it's not just direct threats against Britain that could lead to the UK and Russia going to war. It's Putin's threats against British allies. In January 2024, the British government released a risk analysis that claimed there is a 1 in 4 chance that Russia will launch an attack on a British ally within the next 2 years.
That analysis came just days after General Sanders' warnings and the government's shooting down of those warnings, with the report describing Russia as an adversary state throughout. The report claimed that there was a 25% chance of Russia attacking a non-NATO ally, such as Sweden. Of course, Sweden has since become a member of NATO, potentially reducing the possibility of such an attack. But if it were to occur, Britain would find itself going to war not because it was attacked directly, but because it was bound to do so by Article 5 of the NATO Convention. The article essentially states that an attack on one NATO member's soil is treated as an attack on all members, with those who aren't being attacked duty-bound to come to the defense of the country that's being targeted. The message here is simple. Russian aggression toward countries like Sweden, Finland, or the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia could mean war between Britain and Russia. NATO hasn't lowered these tensions. If anything, it's exacerbated them with the creation of Operation Steadfast Defender 2024. Touted by NATO as the organization's largest military exercise since the Cold War, the joint effort saw 90,000 troops from all of NATO's 32 members converge on Europe to conduct a host of military exercises between January and May 2024. The exercises were split into two parts. First, the United troops would carry out a series of exercises focused on securing the Atlantic Ocean through to the Arctic Ocean. From there, ground-based troops would move across Europe, traveling from the north of the continent through its center and finally into Eastern Europe. NATO's stated goal was simple: demonstrate the organization's ability to defend every inch of its territory. The message to Russia was also clear, as NATO's exercise was designed to showcase that its forces are ready and waiting to fight should Russia launch an attack on a NATO ally. The UK was among the most heavily involved nations in Operation Steadfast Defender, as it sent 16,000 troops, a little under a fifth of the NATO total, and reinforced its commitment to collective defense. Once again, we see an escalation of tensions. Putin has repeatedly warned NATO nations not to get involved in his war against Ukraine. However, Russia's continued aggression has prompted many NATO nations, including the UK, to take stock of their defensive strategies in preparation for what some see as an inevitable war. This collective escalation could place the UK in a position where it has no choice but to go to war with Russia to support other NATO members. Finally, there's one more suggestion that the UK needs to gear up for war with Russia. Its own people think that war is inevitable. That's according to a YouGov poll conducted in February 2024, which quizzed Britons on whether or not they believed the country needed to get ready for a global conflict. Over half, 53%, believe that there will be another world war in the next 5 to 10 years, with 15% claiming that such a war is very likely. Another 38% say that war is somewhat likely, while a further 16% simply don't know one way or the other. On the plus side, 44% of those polled believe that the UK and its Western allies would prevail in a war over Russia and its allies, compared to just 13% who think Russia would win. Where does all of this leave the UK? One of its leading generals claims that war is coming. Since 2000, Britain has seen its relationship with Russia deteriorate enormously, to the point where the UK is referring to Russia as an adversary state in official reports. Moscow has levied threat after threat at Britain in 2024, ranging from mentions of nuclear weapons to warnings of strikes on British military facilities and equipment if Ukraine uses British weapons inside Russia. NATO appears to be preparing for war, having conducted one of the largest cooperative exercises ever during the first half of 2024. And Britain would likely be a major part of that war. And as YouGov reveals, most Britons appear to side with General Sanders and his belief that the war is coming. All of which brings us to another question. Is the UK ready to fight Russia? The simple answer appears to be no, or at least it's not ready to fight Russia alone. Every year, Global Firepower, or GFP, compiles a list of 145 countries with militaries, ranking them based on over 60 factors to determine which is the strongest. The United Kingdom performed well in the 2024 version of this list, achieving a ranking of 6th out of 145. The problem is that Russia came second, and it overpowers the UK in practically every department. Russia has 1.32 million active military personnel, compared to 184,860 in the UK. Russia also has over 1 million more reserve personnel, though the UK comes in with an impressive 924,000. The UK's defense budget is about half of Russia's, and its air force is far smaller, with 664 aerial assets compared to Russia's 4,255. Russia has more tanks, over 130,000 more armored vehicles, and crucially, a navy that contains 664 more assets than the UK's Royal Navy. The last point is important. Britain's island status means that a conventional war would require Russia to attack via sea. Adding to all of this is the nuclear issue discussed earlier, as Russia has enough nuclear weapons to decimate the UK if conventional warfare doesn't do the job. General Sanders recognizes Britain's comparative weakness. In July 2024, he warned that NATO, and Britain by extension, only had about 5 years to prepare for war with Russia. Honing in on Britain's defensive capabilities, he praised the UK's ability to combat cyber threats, as well as its ability to defend against terror attacks. But in a full-blown war, it will be found wanting. We have a huge gap in air defenses, the general claims, adding that Britain needs to ensure that its skies are protected with greater investment and that the undersea cables that we rely on are protected from Russian sabotage. In other words, Britain needs to spend more on its military. Which brings us to the final key question posed in the video. What is the UK doing to ensure it's ready for war with Russia? We've already seen some examples. For instance, the UK taking part in Operation Steadfast Defender 2024 is a purposeful effort to reinforce its defensive ties with dozens of other nations. Cooperative defense will form the majority of the UK's strategy against Russia, as it will lean on Article 5 of the NATO Charter to ensure that other powerful nations, such as France, Germany, and the United States, fight alongside it should Russia attack Britain on its own soil. The UK has also been busy signing security partnerships outside of NATO. For instance, 2017 saw it sign a trilateral submarine agreement that also involves the US and France, with 2021 bringing with it a similar agreement between the UK, the US, and Australia. Though these agreements don't compel any of the signees to come to the other's aid in times of war, the fact that they exist at all suggests that Britain will have plenty of allies on which it could rely during a war with Russia. Of course, allies alone won't win a war. The UK needs to prepare internally. It appears to be doing that by committing to the level of investment General Sanders believes is required. In April 2024, Chatham House reported that former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had pledged to continuously increase Britain's military spending until it reaches 2.5% of gross domestic product, or GDP, by 2030. That would put it above NATO's 2% of GDP guideline, adding an extra £75 billion, or $96 billion, to Britain's defence budget over the next 6 years. Britain's July 2024 general election initially cast this budget in doubt. However, the Labour Party under Keir Starmer has reiterated Britain's intention to hit a 2.5% of GDP target, meaning military spending has survived a changing government. However, these budgetary increases may not be enough. The Institute of Fiscal Studies points out that the £75 billion pledge only works out if the UK intends to freeze its budget every year between 2024 and 30. In other words, a large amount of that money would have been accounted for within existing increases to UK defence spending, which is already at 2.3% of GDP. Taking that existing commitment into account, rising to 2.5% of GDP only adds £20 billion, around $25 billion, to the budget. While still a large amount of money, most of it will go toward plugging current funding gaps in Britain's military. That means it's having to spend more to play catch-up with Russia, rather than spending to strengthen a fighting force that was already capable of winning a war. Nevertheless, the UK has been ordering and building more weapons since the outbreak of the Ukraine war. December 2022 saw it spend almost $300 million on thousands of next-generation light anti-tank weapons, or NLAWs, from Swedish manufacturer Saab. NLAWs can destroy a modern tank from a distance of up to 2,600 feet and would prove extremely effective in a ground war, given Russia's demonstrated reliance on tanks in Ukraine. A further $115 million was committed to buying L403A1 assault rifles, which feature stronger optical sighting systems than Britain's current rifles, as well as a muzzle signature reduction system. The UK government website suggests that up to 10,000 of these rifles may be purchased between 2023 and 33. Forces.net also reported that the UK is investing in drones capable of firing bullets costing as little as 13 cents per round in May 2024. The point here is that the UK is spending the money it has intelligently. It's seen Russia's extensive use of tanks in Ukraine and is investing in NLAWs and drones due to the success Ukraine has enjoyed with both. Purchasing new rifles also means Britain's soldiers would likely be better equipped than Russia's on the battlefield. However, it likely needs to spend more, and faster, if General Sanders' prediction of a conflict within 5 years is true. Right now, Britain's navy doesn't match Russia's in sheer size, even given the fact that much of the Russian navy is made up of patrol boats and smaller warships. Its aerial forces, as Sanders points out, are also not at the level they need to be to establish aerial dominance against Russia. Help from its allies could bolster the UK. But if it's to win against Russia, it likely needs to do more. That may mean an even greater commitment to spending, as well as increasing cooperation with its allies to ensure that collective defense is really what it's touted to be if Russia's aggression extends to Britain's shores. But what do you think? Does the UK really need to prepare for a war with Russia, or is General Sanders focusing on a future that's unlikely to happen? What else should Britain do to bolster its military?
Ukraine has been on a knife edge in its war with Russia over the last year. During that time, it's been forced to confirm that its counteroffensive, which was designed to push Vladimir Putin's troops back, had failed, and it's been gradually losing territory to the Moscow steamroller. Russia has been taking ground. Avdiivka represents perhaps the largest victory for Putin over the last year of the war. The city, which Ukraine had transformed into a fortress, fell in 2024 after Moscow committed wave after wave of attack beginning in October 2023. Putin hailed the taking of Avdiivka as being hugely important for Russia, not least because controlling the city means Ukraine loses its main route into Donetsk. Along with that victory, Russia has made some serious inroads into Bakhmut, as well as taking several villages around Zaporizhia. Some commentators say there's now a stalemate on the front lines. That's not the case. Russia is advancing thanks to its ability to constantly bombard Ukrainian positions with artillery and troops. The war of attrition has been playing out in Putin's favor, not least of which because he has the funds to support his war effort at a time when Ukraine has started to run low. But that's all changed. And with that comes the possibility that Ukraine could be on the verge of destroying Putin's ambitions. All of which brings us to the key questions we'll answer in this video. What's the seismic change that's happened that will allow Ukraine to finally push back against Russia? And perhaps more crucially, what does this mean for Putin's ambitions, not just in Ukraine, but the rest of Europe? The answer to the first of those questions is simple. Both the United Kingdom and the United States have approved massive aid packages that are going to be a major help to Ukraine in the months to come. We'll start with the UK's package. On April 23, 2024, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak travelled to Poland for a meeting in which he aimed to strengthen the country's security ties with one of Europe's emerging military nations. During that meeting, he announced that the UK had approved a £500 million, approximately $620 million, aid package that would account for the country's largest ever delivery of military equipment to a wartime ally. The announcement brought the UK's funding total in Ukraine up to $3.7 billion for the financial year, with most of the money going toward funding equipment that Ukraine desperately needs to fend off the Russian offensive. Among that equipment will be 60 boats, including raiding craft, dive boats, and maritime guns that can be used both to fend off any Russian naval offenses as well as provide Ukraine with options for making inroads into Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine. The UK will also provide 400 military vehicles split between 78 all-terrain vehicles, 160 Husky vehicles, which come with protective armor, and a further 162 armored vehicles of different types. Plus, the UK will bolster Ukraine's missile stocks. The money will pay for 1,600 air defense and strike missiles that may help Ukraine deal with Russia's constant bombardments. Add to that a small number of Storm Shadow long-range guided missiles, which are capable of traveling for about 150 miles, providing Ukraine with the ability to strike Russian targets from a great distance, and you have a comprehensive equipment package. And that's not all. The UK will also provide Ukraine's ground soldiers with 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition, as well as support from its engineering industry. There's also mention of supplying drones in the press release announcing the aid package. The UK's Defence Secretary Grant Shapps was bullish when speaking about the package, pointing out that the UK was the first to provide Ukraine with modern tanks, long-range missiles, and NLAW anti-tank missiles. Now we are going even further. We will never let the world forget the existential battle Ukraine is fighting, and with our enduring support, they will win. Those are big words. But as impressive as the UK's aid package may be, alone it would not be enough to turn the tide of war in Ukraine's favour. At best, it would give Ukraine enough ammunition to defend itself for a few more months, but more is needed for Ukraine to stand any chance of destroying Putin's hope of taking the country. Enter the United States. After months of political wrangling, the US Senate has finally approved a massive $95 billion aid package. Signed and sealed by President Joe Biden, that money will go to supporting Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine, with the latter getting the lion's share of the funding. According to the BBC, it's expected that $61 billion of that money will be dedicated to providing military aid to Kyiv, making the package about 10 times the size of that being delivered by the UK. The package has been a long time coming. As Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer pointed out, after more than 6 months of hard work and many twists and turns in the road, America sends a message to the entire world: we will not turn our back on you. Defense One offers more details on how Ukraine will likely spend the money. It says that $13.7 billion will go to the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which works on behalf of Kyiv to procure new weapons. Another $1.6 billion will go to a similar weapons acquisition scheme, the Foreign Military Financing Program, which is overseen by the US State Department. Add to that $13.4 billion that will be used to replace weapons the US has already sent over that have since been lost in the war, along with funding for further training of Ukrainian troops, and you have a substantial aid package, albeit one that comes with a few strings attached. Those strings include provisions in the bill that the US can withdraw the funding if Ukraine doesn't spend the money in a way that the US sees as fitting. That seems unlikely. America is already working closely with Ukraine in terms of how it spends the funds, with most of it being dedicated to purchasing American equipment that Ukraine needs anyway. Ukraine can deal with that. It's also important to point out that Ukraine isn't getting all of that money, or the equipment that it will buy, in one go. Defense One says that the first tranche of weapons the US will send to Ukraine under the new aid package will have a total of $1 billion, about a 60th of the total aid. The package is likely to include anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, along with 155mm shells, armored vehicles, and long-range rockets. Unfortunately, there are no specific numbers at the time of creating this video, though it's safe to assume they'll be somewhat similar to the UK's. And there's more. Along with finally passing the bill for aid to Ukraine, the US House of Representatives has passed another bill that could be just as damaging to Putin. A bill that allows the US to seize Russian assets held in American banks before transferring them to Ukraine for its war effort. That bill still needs to make it through the Senate, but if it passes, it would represent a bold move by the United States that could see it free up around $67 billion in assets that would essentially double the aid package it's sending to Ukraine. That bill could also serve as a trigger for other nations to do the same. After all, the $67 billion in frozen assets that the US holds is just a fifth of the $300 billion plus of frozen assets held around the world. According to Russia's central bank, Moscow has around $207 billion invested in the euro, along with $37 billion invested in the British pound. There are also tens of billions of dollars invested into the Japanese yen and Canadian and Australian dollars. Imagine what would happen if the nations controlling these currencies all followed America's lead. Ukraine would suddenly have access to over $300 billion of Russia's frozen money, which it could use to fund its defense. Of course, Putin has been quick to call any type of seizure illegal and has threatened retaliation if it happens. So the fact that the US even has a bill at all, never mind one that's passed through the House of Representatives and seems to have support of key Republican Party players, suggests that the wider world is ready to take a more aggressive approach to dealing with Putin's attempts to take Ukraine. And that brings us neatly to the second question we posed at the beginning of the video. Why does the renewed aid the United Kingdom and the United States providing to Ukraine spell such bad news for Putin? There are several answers to this question, starting with the most obvious one. The aid bolsters Ukraine's defense at a time when Russia has been slowly pushing it back in a devastating war of attrition. Right now, Russia controls around 18% of Ukrainian land, which it's managed to gain by virtue of having more equipment and manpower. That equipment advantage has come to the fore in Russia's reliance on constant missile and drone barrages over Ukrainian cities, which are supplemented by its ability to send soldier after soldier into the fight with seemingly no sign of letting up. That strategy is unlikely to change in the short term. In 2024 alone, Russia has already captured 138 square miles of Ukrainian territory, and if Ukraine's defense intelligence heads are to be believed, is planning to launch a renewed offensive at some point during May 2024. That offensive will likely focus on the small town of Chaziv Yar in Donetsk. That would be bad news for Ukraine, because the capture of that town would open the way to Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, two Ukrainian strongholds in the Donbas region. Chatham House also believes it's likely that Putin will intensify Russia's missile and drone strikes, focusing on Ukrainian infrastructure, logistical routes, and industrial base. All have suffered in recent months from a lack of air defenses. And it's here where we may see the tide start to turn. As part of its aid package, the United States is supposedly providing a Patriot missile defense system to Ukraine, with that system being capable of shooting down many of the types of missiles that Russia will use in these attacks. Germany has also committed to sending one, with Greece and Spain also facing increasing pressure to transfer their Patriot systems to Ukraine. Add to that the money Ukraine can now access, which it would use to purchase more Patriot missile systems, along with the ammunition they require, and the country is now in a better position to defend itself against missile strikes. Why is that such bad news for Putin? It's possible that Russia might start running low on missiles if it has to start firing more to achieve the same results it enjoyed before Ukraine got access to these new Patriot systems. Back in January 2023, Ukrainian intelligence officers started to suggest that Russia was running low on its ballistic missile stocks. A Ukrainian Air Force official named Yuri Inat suggested that Moscow had fewer than 100 of its Iskander missiles left due to its repeated strikes throughout 2022, forcing it to rely on its weaker S-300 and S-400 systems. The S-300s date back to the days of the Soviet Union, making them less reliable than their supposedly dwindling modern alternatives. Their use, suggested Inat, meant that Russia must be running low on ballistic missiles. But that was over a year ago, and the barrages kept coming. Still, it highlights the equipment and munitions challenges both face in what has become the modern example of what industrialized ground warfare looks like. According to Reuters, Russia has already fired 8,000 missiles, along with sending 4,630 Shahid drones into Ukraine. It's making and buying more, but that rate of use will eventually mean Moscow starts to run low, with Ukraine being aided by its new missile defense systems to put an even more severe dent in Moscow's missile stockpiles. In short, Putin may not be able to rely on his missile barrages for as long as he would have done without the aid packages. And given that those packages include supplying Ukraine with more missiles of its own, he may also find that the ground Russia has already taken in the country could be subjected to the very same missile strategies he used to take that ground in the first place. But Putin has a workaround for that problem, one he's already been using to great effect in Ukraine: glide bombs. In an interview with the UK's Times radio station, Professor Michael Clarke, a fellow of King's College in London, discussed Russia's use of these bombs. Specifically, he highlighted the Fab 500 and Fab 1500 variants, which are capable of carrying warheads weighing 1,102 pounds and 3,306 pounds respectively. These are very old bombs. They're not equipped with the precision-guided systems that modern missiles have, though their payloads are so massive that it doesn't really matter. As long as Russia can drop the bombs in proximity of their targets, they don't need direct strikes. The bombs can still cause damage. Clarke points out that Moscow has found a way to fit small wings to these bombs, giving them the ability to glide towards a target after being dropped from an aircraft. That's been huge for Putin. One of Russia's planes can drop a glide bomb from 30,000 feet in the air while being 50 miles behind the front lines and still know that it's likely to hit its target. The bombs were crucial to Russia's taking of Avdiivka. According to Le Monde, one Ukrainian fighter said, "These bombs completely destroy any position. All buildings and structures simply turn into a pit after the arrival of just one KAB, a term used for the glide bombs. And they drop 60 to 80 pieces on us in just one day," the soldier concluded. Countering those bombs is going to be a huge challenge for Ukraine. The only thing Ukraine can really do, according to Clarke, is take out or chase off the Russian planes that are dropping the bombs in the first place. That's where the Patriot systems may come into play again, as their range is such that they can target and hit Russian planes stationed 50 miles behind the front lines, potentially taking them out of the game before they can launch their deadly payloads. Again, another huge boon for Ukraine. If it's able to get its hands on more fighter jets, the Netherlands will provide it with 6 that were previously meant for sale in the US, as of a February 2024 report. It could even take the fight to those bomb-dropping planes. These are all little steps. And given that the funding is staggered, as well as Ukraine having to wait for equipment to arrive before it can deploy it, it's likely that Russia will still manage to advance in the near term. But with the new defensive systems in place, Ukraine can stem the bleeding and potentially take advantage of Russia's munitions starting to dry up at a key point where it's receiving a fresh load of weaponry and equipment. Ukraine will also be able to counter the glide bombs, albeit only partially, reducing their effectiveness on the battlefield to the point where Ukraine can hold its cities for longer. And that ability to hold for longer is another reason why the UK's and America's aid packages could destroy Putin's ambitions. It will lead to Russia losing more soldiers. In his interview, Clarke highlights that Russia is still losing around 900 soldiers per day to a Ukraine that is war-weary and running out of equipment. It's been able to sustain those losses because of the sheer size of its army. According to Global Firepower, Russia ranks 5th in the world for active military personnel with 1.32 million, and it has 2 million reservists along with 250,000 paramilitary members. Moscow won't run out of people anytime soon. Its problem comes in funneling those huge numbers into Ukraine, which has become a slightly easier task now it controls territory in the country. But even with that territory, losing 900 people per day is a massive burden. Now that Ukraine has enough money to purchase more artillery shells and small arms ammunition, its ground troops will be able to kill even more of Putin's soldiers. That doesn't necessarily mean Ukraine will be able to force a counterattack with this funding, according to Clarke. But it does mean that Russia will be forced to sustain higher losses than it has over the last few months, potentially weakening its hold on territory it's taken during 2023 and the first part of 2024. In short, Ukraine now has what it needs to start pushing Russia back. And that gives Ukraine 2 things that it hasn't had in a long time: breathing room and the ability to plan for the future. Now that it's better able to fend off attacks, Ukraine's frontline forces won't be in the state of panic and chaos that Russia has placed them under for much of 2024. They'll be able to launch coordinated attacks with the equipment to back them up, as well as better coordinate their defenses against Russian assaults.
Clark speculates that this could slow down the Russian advance to the point where the war returns to the stalemate position it seemed to be during the beginning of 2023, giving Ukraine valuable time to plan how to use its new resources both to defend and attack. As for the control issue, Ukraine now has stability in terms of knowing what's coming in and where. It knows that the UK is going to deliver 60 boats, 400 vehicles, and 1,600 missiles, with that knowledge allowing it to plan ahead on how to maximize that equipment rather than being in a position where it has to constantly scramble to react to Russian attacks. The same will go for America's military aid package. It all feeds into giving Ukraine more control in the conflict and buoys the morale of troops that have been seeing their supplies constantly dwindling over the past year. That's not what Putin wants. As Clark points out in the Radio Times interview, Putin's strategy has been to slowly put the squeeze on Ukraine by forcing it to face up to what felt like insurmountable odds. He knew Ukraine was running low on equipment. All he had to do was keep pushing, slowly but surely, perhaps to the point where he could force a political crisis in the country. That crisis may have been the ousting of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and opening the door to a new leader who was sympathetic to Putin's ambitions. A leader who might hand over the territory Russia has already captured to keep the peace. That's not going to happen anymore, at least not for the next year, according to Clark. He highlights these new aid packages could restore Ukraine to the point where it's again able to expend the 10,000 artillery shells it was using to keep Russia at bay near the beginning of the war, creating a stalemate situation again right as Russia looks set to push deeper into Ukraine. Clark believes that Putin thought that the aid packages, particularly the one from the United States, wouldn't get through the Senate. Now he faces a situation where Ukraine has a renewed flow of supplies that will increase troop morale and could lead to Russia's soldiers facing a much harder fight than they faced for the last year. Does that mean Putin will be forced to leave Ukraine? Not necessarily. But there's another element to this aid package that is huge for the potential outcome of the war and may play the biggest role in destroying Putin's ambitions. It's a sign that the rest of Europe is waking up to the threat that Russia poses. Take the UK as a perfect example. When speaking about the country's most recent $620 million package, Rishi Sunak made it clear that the package represented the UK getting on a war footing for the first time in decades. The aid pledge came with another that would see the UK increase its defense spending to 2.5% of GDP, amounting to around $93 billion over the next 6 years, with Sunak calling it the biggest strengthening of our national defense for a generation. He went on to point out that the world is the most dangerous it's been since the end of the Cold War, while warning against taking a complacent approach that would see Russia take Ukraine and potentially turn its attention to other European countries. The country also intends to invest around $12 billion into ammunition production, likely as a result of having seen Russia's tactics in Ukraine. There are signs of the British war machine starting to activate elsewhere. Beyond sending aid to Ukraine, the UK has also announced that it intends to deploy some of its Typhoon fighter jets to Poland, giving Poland more options when it comes to policing its skies. It's not outside the realms of possibility that those jets will be there to keep an eye on what Russia does should it take Ukraine. After all, as AP News points out, Poland has already seen Russian incursions into its airspace since the war in Ukraine began. Even more worrying for Putin is that it's not just the UK that's on notice. The rest of Europe is quickly figuring out that the Russian war machine might target them next. Before the UK and the US announced their aid bills, the EU had agreed to send $53 billion in financial support between 2024 and 27. Rather than being dedicated to funding military equipment, the EU said the money could be used to keep the country's administration running. More bad news for Putin, as well as paying for salaries, pensions, and public services. So there's funding coming from two fronts, military and civilian aid, that could strengthen Ukraine in its fight against Russia. America's substantial aid package also places pressure on many European countries to follow suit with packages of their own. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia have contributed massive amounts already, with the latter having committed 1.5% of its GDP to Ukraine, with Estonia and Lithuania committing 1.8%. Germany is delivering a Patriot system to Ukraine, as mentioned earlier, with the country already having established itself as the biggest supplier of military aid to Ukraine behind the United States. And of course, we have France's President Macron talking about the possibility of sending NATO troops into Ukraine to fight Russia is still on the table, even if the rest of NATO's leaders claim that's an impossibility. These are far from the only examples, but all prove that Europe is increasingly concerned about Putin's ambitions, both for Ukraine itself and for the rest of the continent, should he succeed in taking Ukraine. Again, that's not what Putin wanted. His invasion of Ukraine was meant to be a smash and grab. The country was supposed to roll over in a matter of months, accept that it would become part of Russia, and the rest of Europe would just have to deal with it. Instead, Ukraine has held on. It's now being buoyed by financial aid that will allow it to fight for another year, and Putin is having to watch as the rest of Europe mobilizes production while committing even more money to Ukraine, so it'll be ready to fight if Putin turns his attentions beyond Ukraine. It all adds up to Russia potentially losing steam in Ukraine. Putin has already responded by threatening to increase the rate of missile strikes in Ukraine in response to America's aid bill passing. Through his defense minister Sergei Shoigu, Putin said that Russia will increasingly target storage bases and logistics centers for Western weapons in response. Russian propaganda has also started the nuclear weapons conversation again, with Newsweek reporting on April 29th that state TV channel Russia 1 news anchor Dmitry Kiselyov has talked about Russian nuclear launches on the air. He said that if NATO troops enter Ukraine, Russian nukes would not only disarm France in an instant, a clear shot at Macron, but would target American decision-making centers. Those words may not come directly from Putin, but they come from a prominent figure on Russian state-sponsored television, meaning we can assume Putin approves. And as Clark concludes in his interview with Times Radio, the renewed threats of nuclear war could be a sign that Russia is worried. It knows Ukraine is going to get a heavy injection of military equipment, and that injection may just be a heavy enough dose to stop the Russian war machine in its tracks. But what do you think? Could the announcement of financial aid from the UK and the US help Ukraine to turn the tide in the war? Is it all a case of too little too late? And is Putin genuinely worried about the rest of Europe mobilizing in the wake of his invasion? Are his plans going to come crumbling down? Tensions between Russia and NATO are reaching boiling point, with both sides claiming that they're preparing for the threat of war with the other. If that happens, the conflict would spread throughout Europe and, thanks to Article 5 of the NATO Charter, would draw in other major Western powers such as the United States. And there's one region that lies at the center of it all: Kaliningrad. Russia's enclave is situated in the perfect place to serve as a launching point for an attack, and it's long been considered a risky area by many in the West. Now that risk may soon be realized, which leads us to the question we'll answer in this video. Why will Kaliningrad be at the center of a war between Russia and NATO? To answer that question, we first need to offer some insight into what Kaliningrad is and what it represents to Russia. Kaliningrad traces its roots back to the 13th century when it was founded as Königsberg by the Teutonic Knights. Since then, it's passed through several different hands, with the Hanseatic League once claiming the region as well as Prussia, which named Königsberg its capital. However, it was World War II that saw the region fully enter the Russian sphere of influence. The 5,830 square mile patch of land, which is sandwiched between Lithuania, Poland, and the Baltic Sea, became a key strategic location during that war. It was bombed extensively by both German and Soviet forces, with the Soviet Union eventually coming out on top. That enabled it to annex the region, transforming it into the Kaliningrad Oblast. The Soviet Union wasted no time in making use of its new land. After expelling most of the remaining Germans, it transformed Kaliningrad into a closed military zone. Heavy industrialization took place, though there was little to stop the Soviet Union from doing what it wanted with the oblast. After all, Lithuania was under Soviet rule as well, meaning it had direct access to Kaliningrad. To all intents and purposes, Kaliningrad was part of Russia. That changed following the fall of the Soviet Union and the entry of the Baltic states into the EU. Though Kaliningrad was and still is part of the Russian Federation, it became cut off. Russia couldn't transport anything into the oblast by land without passing through EU territory first, as both Poland and Lithuania joined the organization in 2004. That fact has led to growing tension. That's particularly the case in Lithuania, where friction over transit regulations has been common, according to the BBC. Nevertheless, Russia has worked hard to not only maintain control over the oblast, but to ensure that it plays a key role in its current military strategy. It's now home to Russia's Baltic fleet, which is believed to contain 1 submarine and 43 surface vessels, and it represents the only ice-free port Russia has in Europe. That's a crucial distinction. Kaliningrad's Baltic is the only European port Russia owns that it can use all year round. But despite being owned by the Russian Federation, Kaliningrad is something more of a Europe-centric Russian territory. As the BBC demonstrates, the construction of a $45 million airport terminal in 2007, coupled with Kaliningrad's proximity to several EU countries, saw it increasingly trading with nations outside of Russia. That trade led to a growing economy and improved industrial output, though both were put to the test by the global financial crisis of 2008. Back then, Kaliningrad's unemployment levels rose to 10%, much higher than the Russian average of the time, and may have sown some seeds of discontent in the oblast that we'll explore later. Still, Kaliningrad remains extremely important as a tactical location for Russia, and that brings us back to the prospect of war between Russia and NATO. If it were to erupt, why would Kaliningrad be at the center of it all?
Part of the answer comes down to missiles, specifically Russia's short-range Iskander ballistic nuclear missiles, which the BBC claims have been in Kaliningrad since at least 2013. At the time, Russia was cagey about whether it had deployed missiles to the oblast, though it later confirmed the reports in 2016. The countries bordering Kaliningrad expressed their dismay. Both Poland and Lithuania reacted with shock, with the latter claiming the move may have violated international weapons treaties, while the Polish government in a subdued response called the action very alarming. Back then, Lithuania accused Russia of using the nuclear weapons to seek concessions from the West amidst growing tensions over its actions in Syria. Lithuania also pointed out that it had tracked several Russian military exercises in the oblast, including some scenarios in which troops stationed in Kaliningrad would launch Iskander missiles. Russia played coy. At the time, it dismissed the concerns, claiming the contingents of missile troops have been moved many times and will continue to be moved to the Kaliningrad region as part of a Russian armed forces training plan. Western commentators weren't being fooled by Russia's 2016 claims. One of those commentators was Judy Dempsey, who serves as a senior associate at the European base of the Carnegie Endowment. She claimed that the Iskander deployments were intended to divide the West and were timed specifically to disrupt the looming US presidential elections. These types of moves by Russia are making the Europeans and the US nervous, she claimed, before adding, Putin is pressing all the buttons. In other words, the deployment of Iskander missiles was an intimidation tactic aimed specifically at Poland and the Baltic nations of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Russia's message was simple: we have nuclear weapons in a location from which we could easily launch them at any of you. And that message was accompanied by the unspoken, but no less dangerous, message that its Iskanders could hit almost any European nation from Kaliningrad. Given that most of Russia's potential targets are NATO members, using them would trigger a global war. Of course, we know that didn't happen in 2016. Still, the threat of the Iskanders in Kaliningrad persists. Those missiles are still there, and they present a clear danger. The 9K720 Iskander, also known as the SS-26, is a 23.9-foot road-mobile missile that's capable of carrying a nuclear payload between 1,058 and 1,543 pounds. Russia began development on the missile in the 1980s, intending it to be a replacement for the OTR-23, which was banned under the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. It's far from being the rangiest missile in the Russian arsenal, as it's only capable of traveling 310 miles. That would be a problem if it was only stationed in the Russian mainland. However, the missile's presence in Kaliningrad means that the range is more than enough to hit most potential targets in Europe. The Baltic states are under clear threat. The same goes for the Nordic states, as well as much of mainland Europe. All are within the range of the Iskander. Worse yet, the fact that its launcher is built into an 8-wheel MZKT 7930 truck means it can be transported closer to a target if needed and fired directly from the truck. Each of these trucks carries 2 Iskanders. As for the warhead, Russia has choices. The base version of the missile is usually equipped with a high-explosive warhead that isn't nuclear, but can still pack a major punch. However, that can be replaced with a submunition, earth penetrator, or thermobaric warhead as the situation requires. The latter represents the biggest danger Kaliningrad poses to NATO countries. Also known as a vacuum bomb, a thermobaric warhead contains a fuel container with a pair of explosive charges. Once it detonates, the first charge splits the container, spreading a cloud-like fuel mixture far and wide. Buildings and other military defenses are penetrated by this cloud, with only those that are perfectly sealed from the outside world standing a chance. Then, the second charge detonates. And with that, the entire cloud goes up in flames, creating a massive fireball that generates a blast wave combined with a vacuum that sucks all of the surrounding oxygen out of the air to fuel the fire. Buildings and other structures nearby are destroyed, with anybody unfortunate enough to be caught in the blast being burnt to nothingness. Or if they're further away, being subjected to the combined force of the blast wave and the feeling that air is basically being sucked out of their lungs. These are devastating weapons, with the only solace being that the Iskander's thermobaric warheads are limited to 1,543 pounds. That's still enough to cause plenty of damage, though it pales in comparison to the GBU-43B Massive Ordnance Air Blast Bomb, MOAB, nicknamed Mother of All Bombs. Developed by the US in 2003, this vacuum bomb weighs over 21,600 pounds. It's unknown exactly how many Iskander missiles are in Kaliningrad. However, it was reported that they were sent to at least 7 of the 10 missile brigades stationed in the oblast back in 2016, suggesting there are plenty to go around should Russia launch an attack from there. And it gets worse. In June 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin promised that Moscow would send some of its Iskander missiles to Belarus in the coming months. That development is notable for 2 reasons.
First, Belarus is one of the few allies that Russia has in mainland Europe, with the country even having served as Russia's pathway into Ukraine during the early parts of the Ukraine war. Secondly, Belarus may provide a route through which Russia can funnel even more Iskander missiles into Kaliningrad. After all, it borders the Suwalki Gap. This small stretch of land, which runs for about 62 miles along the Lithuanian and Polish borders, separates Belarus from Kaliningrad. It, along with its accompanying town of Druskininkai, was once designated an official Russian spa resort in the 19th century, with the region often being visited by Russian civil servants of the time. Right up until the Ukraine war, it was a popular tourist destination for Russians. It would likely be one of Putin's first targets if he began a war with NATO. Securing the Suwalki Gap would give Russia a route into Kaliningrad from Belarus. That could prove vital if NATO were able to cut Kaliningrad off from Russian ships in the Baltic Sea, as well as giving Putin more options for getting his missiles and troops into the Russian oblast. Perhaps an assault on the Suwalki Gap is in the back of Putin's mind. After all, he followed through on his June 2022 promises to Belarus, as confirmed by the country's exiled opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. In June 2023, he warned that Belarus's leader, Alexander Lukashenko, had proudly announced the arrival of the first Russian missiles and bombs to his country. Russia appears to be preparing for something. Still, some might justify Russia's actions in Kaliningrad as those of a country that's just trying to protect its territory. After all, the oblast is separated from the Russian mainland and has unfriendly countries on all of its borders. Perhaps Putin is just making sure Kaliningrad is protected. That might be the cause. However, recent Russian actions suggest that Putin has far more planned for Kaliningrad. Take his warnings to Sweden prior to the Nordic nation joining NATO. In April 2022, the deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, warned both Sweden and Finland that if they joined NATO, Russia would respond by strengthening its naval, air, and land forces in the Baltic Sea. Chillingly, he was explicit about the nuclear threat that would result, claiming that there would be no more talk of a nuclear-free Baltic if the two countries joined NATO. Medvedev urged Sweden and Finland to see sense. If they didn't, he warned, Kaliningrad will become home to not only the Iskander missiles that are already believed to be there, but Russian hypersonic missiles. Each could be used to strike Sweden or Finland. Granted, these threats weren't new. Kaliningrad is already home to Iskander missiles, and many European leaders believe Russia had stocked the enclave with nuclear warheads even before the issue of Sweden, Finland, and NATO arose. Still, Putin is stoking the flames of a fire that's already threatening to get out of control, and he's using Kaliningrad as the focal point of his threats. There are also the simulations to consider. The Arms Control Association, or ACA, reports that May 2022 brought with it several military exercises in Kaliningrad that focused on simulating nuclear weapons launches. These happened just a month after Russia delivered its threats to Sweden and Finland, with the clear message being that Kaliningrad not only hosts nuclear weapons, but that the troops stationed there know how to launch them. The ACA reports that the simulations involved electronic launches of Iskander missiles at targets including military command posts, airfields, and equipment depots. Over 100 troops were involved. Russia's rhetoric around the simulations focused on Ukraine. The leader of its arms control delegation in Vienna, Konstantin Gavrilov, claimed that Russia by no means pursues any nuclear war-related aims on the territory of Ukraine. Those comments were backed by Alexei Zaitsev, the deputy spokesman of Russia's foreign ministry, who said that the weapons being tested in Kaliningrad are not applicable to the implementation of the tasks set in the course of the special military operation in Ukraine. Perhaps they're both telling the truth. But in doing so, they also hide that the simulations served more to warn Sweden and Finland rather than to intimidate Ukraine. Even with all of this taken into account, some may see Russia's simulations and use of Kaliningrad to host Iskander missiles as little more than nuclear saber-rattling. It wouldn't be the first time that Russia has levied threats to the West, after all. That brings us to another question. What does NATO think about Russia's actions in Kaliningrad and elsewhere? For much of the Ukraine war, NATO has actively denied that there would be any chance of a larger war taking place between it and Russia. That's still the case, at least officially. The NATO website goes to great pains to say that NATO does not seek confrontation and poses no threat to Russia, instead painting itself as a force for defense and deterrence. It supports Ukraine in its right to self-defense, it says, which extends to allowing NATO members to deliver military aid to the beleaguered nation. However, there are suggestions that some inside NATO have started to seriously consider the possibility of war in 2024. In January 2024, those considerations were made clear by Bob Boyer, a Dutch admiral who serves as NATO's military committee chief. He said, "We have to realize it's not a given that we are in peace, and that's why we are preparing for conflict with Russia." The "we" in this instance refers to NATO's forces rather than the Dutch military.
Boyer's words were echoed by Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, who pointed out that we hear threats from the Kremlin almost every day. He made specific note of those threats being directed at the Baltic states, which would fall well within Kaliningrad's missile firing line if a war were to break out. Then there are the French President Emmanuel Macron's comments in February 2024 to consider. He claimed that France and its European NATO allies couldn't rule out the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine. Though he tempered these remarks by noting that there was no NATO consensus on the idea, and many NATO-aligned leaders were quick to say it wouldn't happen, the remarks were taken as a clear threat by Putin. Tensions escalated again, and Putin was quick to respond. Just days after Macron's statement, Putin delivered his annual State of the Nation speech. In it, he mentioned Sweden and Finland, both of which had ignored his warnings to join NATO, and claimed that NATO forces were preparing to strike our territory. He also touched on the idea that NATO-aligned countries might send troops into Ukraine, as suggested by Macron, which again led to nuclear threats. Western nations must realize that we also have weapons that can hit targets on their territory, Putin said. All this really threatens a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons and the destruction of civilization. Don't they get that? More anger followed when several NATO nations, including the Baltic states, the United Kingdom, and crucially, the United States, gave Ukraine the go-ahead to use the weapons they supply on Russian territory. While some of those permissions come with caveats, the US says Ukraine can only use American weapons near the Kharkiv border, Putin has taken that as yet another act of NATO aggression. Russia accused NATO of provoking a new level of tension, with a Kremlin spokesperson named Dmitry Peskov noting that they are in every possible way provoking Ukraine to continue this senseless war. A senseless war that Russia started. All of which brings us back to Kaliningrad. If the rising tensions between NATO and Russia finally boil over, Kaliningrad would be at the forefront of the war. Russia would try to use it to take control of the Baltic Sea, kicking NATO out of the waterway and securing supply routes between mainland ports and Kaliningrad in the process. It may also use Kaliningrad as the starting point for its attacks. Even if Russia doesn't resort to using its Iskander missiles to strike European targets immediately, Kaliningrad is also home to supposedly up to 200,000 military personnel. Notably, that's more than the current Lithuania armed forces, suggesting that these soldiers may be used to launch an attack on Kaliningrad's Baltic neighbor, in what would be the first move in a Russian effort to take the rest of the Baltic states. Likewise, NATO sees the strategic importance of Kaliningrad. Those Russian soldiers may be forced to stay in the exclave as a defensive force as NATO attacks from all sides. Lithuania would likely send in troops, relying on Latvia and Estonia to defend against Russian encroachment from the east, while Poland would also attack the exclave. It's also worth noting that Poland is already taking steps over Kaliningrad. In May 2024, The Guardian reported that Poland had started naming Kaliningrad Królewicz in its official documents. That's the name the territory had when it fell under Polish rule in the 15th and 16th centuries. Perhaps that's a sign that Poland considers Kaliningrad its own territory, which could raise future questions within NATO about what would happen were it to win a war against Russia. Alternatively, Poland may have made the move to poke at Russia and showcase how it doesn't want to return to the Soviet era. That's certainly the impression that Waldemar Buda, Poland's Minister of Development and Technology, gave when he said, "We do not want Russification in Poland, and that's why we've decided to change the name in our native language of Kaliningrad and the Kaliningrad region." Regardless, were it not for its missiles, Kaliningrad would likely be easily overrun by NATO, taking away one of Russia's largest nuclear threats to the rest of Europe. Still, we can't forget that this threat exists. Perhaps any NATO attempt to take Kaliningrad would lead to Russia turning its Iskander missile simulations into a reality. Sweden, Finland, the Baltics, and Poland would all be potential targets, with none of them having nuclear threats of their own with which to counter Russia. But perhaps they don't need those threats. After all, each of these countries is a NATO member, with Article 5 of the NATO Charter meaning that all other members have a duty to collectively defend them. That would bring the US, UK, and France into the nuclear game, which collectively have 5,749 nuclear weapons at their disposal, according to the ACA. Granted, not all of those weapons are active, with the US in particular being in the process of retiring around 1,400 of its nukes. Still, that collective nuclear power is enough to rival Russia, which has 5,889 nuclear weapons available. Perhaps the threat of global nuclear annihilation would be enough to prevent Putin from pushing the button. That seems unlikely, not only because Kaliningrad represents a vital strategic position to Russia, but also because the country's president has demonstrated through the Ukraine war that restoring Russia to its former glory is a key motivator. He wouldn't be willing to sacrifice Kaliningrad to NATO, which may be why he has such a powerful nuclear deterrent installed in the exclave. Still, there may be another route for NATO: Kaliningrad's people. Many of them believe that Kaliningrad should no longer be a part of Russia. Instead, they wish to transform the territory into a fourth Baltic state, operating independently of its current Moscow masters. That's the impression that the Human Security Center gives when reporting on the action that some Kaliningrad natives took after the Ukraine war began. For instance, many of its citizens, who refer to themselves as Baltic Russians, took to the streets of Poland when Russia began its war. There, they protested in front of the Russian embassy and threatened to hold a referendum for Kaliningrad's independence should the Kremlin fail to demilitarize the exclave by 50% and de-escalate the tensions in Ukraine. Russia did neither. That resulted in the creation of an online referendum that took place in 2023, covering 5 Russian regions. All 5 voted in favor of independence from Russia, with Kaliningrad's population being overwhelmingly in favor. The referendum took place over 13 days and saw 19.4% of the exclave's population deliver their votes. After the 95,567 votes were tallied, it was found that 72.1% favored independence. There are caveats here. The referendum was non-binding and, in Russia's eyes, potentially illegal due to the challenge it presented to Russian sovereignty. That may explain the low turnout, though the suggestion remains that the people of Kaliningrad would welcome freedom from Russia and a chance to further engage with the wider European community. Of course, Russia won't hand over Kaliningrad so easily. It certainly won't allow it to become independent, though the desire for that independence could open the door for NATO propaganda to win the day in a war. Kaliningrad won't start a war between Russia and NATO in the sense that its people will begin the fighting, but they won't have a choice if war erupts. Kaliningrad will be at the center of everything. Russia will use it to launch missiles against NATO's European members, as well as potentially use it to fight, along with Belarus, to isolate the Baltic states. NATO will fight for Kaliningrad to remove a clear Russian threat to the NATO members, Lithuania and Poland, that share a border with the exclave. They may also be able to use Kaliningrad to create an inroad into Belarus, which would likely support Russia in a wider war. The exclave is a powder keg. The question now is, will Russia or NATO light the fuse? Let us know what you think. Is Kaliningrad really going to be at the center of a war between Russia and NATO? If so, how important do you believe securing the exclave will be for either side if war erupts?